Chapter 12. See the Pale Martyr. It was about this time that Rebecca, who had been reading about the Spartan boy, conceived the idea of some mild form of self-punishment to be applied on occasions when she was fully convinced in her own mind that it would be salutary. The immediate cause of the decision was a somewhat sadder accident than was common, even in a career prolific in such things. Clad in her best, Rebecca had gone to take tea with the Cobbs, but while crossing the bridge she was suddenly overcome by the beauty of the river, and leaned over the newly painted rail to feast her eyes on the dashing torrent of the fall. Resting her elbows on the topmost board, and inclining her little figure forward in delicious ease, she stood there dreaming. The river above the dam was a glassy lake, with all the loveliness of blue heaven and green shore reflected in its surface. The fall was a swirling wonder of water, ever pouring itself over and over inexhaustibly in luminous golden gushes that lost themselves in snowy depths of foam. Sparkling in the sunshine, gleaming under the summer moon, cold and gray beneath a November sky, trickling over the dam in some burning July drought, swollen with turbulent power in some April freshet, how many young eyes gazed into the mystery and majesty of the falls along that river, and how many young hearts dreamed out their futures leaning over the bridge rail, seeing the vision splendid reflected there, and often, too, watching it fade into the common light of day. Rebecca never went across the bridge without bending over the rail to wonder and to ponder, and at this special moment she was putting the finishing touches on a poem. Two maidens by a river strayed, down in the state of Maine. The one was called Rebecca, the other Emma Jane. I would my life were like the stream, said her named Emma Jane, so quiet and so very smooth, so free from every pain. I'd rather be a little drop in the great rushing fall. I would not choose the glassy lake, 'twould not suit me at all. It was the darker maiden spoke, the words I have just stated. The maidens twain were simply friends, and not at all related. But oh, alas, we may not have the things we hope to gain. The quiet life may come to me, the rush to Emma Jane. I don't like the rush to Emma Jane, and I can't think of anything else. Ugh, what a smell of paint! Oh, it is on me! Oh, it's all over my best dress! Oh, what will Aunt Miranda say? With tears of self-reproach streaming from her eyes, Rebecca flew up the hill, sure of sympathy, and hoping against hope for help of some sort. Mrs. Cobb took in the situation at a glance, and professed herself able to remove almost any stain from almost any fabric, and in this she was corroborated by Uncle Jerry, who vowed that Mother could get anything out. Sometimes she took the cloth right along with the spot, but she had a sure hand, Mother had. The damaged garment was removed and partially immersed in turpentine, while Rebecca graced the festal board, clad in a blue calico wrapper of Mrs. Cobb's. "Don't let it take your appetite away," crooned Mrs. Cobb. "I've got cream biscuit and honey for you. If the turpentine don't work, I'll try French chalk, magnesia, and warm suds. If they fail, Father shall run over to Strout's and borry some of the stuff Marthy got in Milltown to take the currant pie out of her weddin' dress." "I ain't got to understandin' this paintin' accident yet," said Uncle Jerry jocosely, as he handed Rebecca the honey. "Bein' as how there's fresh paint signs hung all over the bridge, so blind asylum couldn't miss 'em, I can't hardly account for your gettin' into the pesky stuff." "I didn't notice the signs," Rebecca said dolefully. "I suppose I was looking at the falls." "The falls has been there since the beginning o' time, and I calc'late they'll be there till the end on it, so you needn't 'a' been in such a brash to get a sight of 'em. Children comes turrible high, Mother, but I suppose we must have 'em," he said, winking at Mrs. Cobb. When supper was cleared away, Rebecca insisted on washing and wiping the dishes, while Mrs. Cobb worked on the dress with an energy that plainly showed the gravity of the task. Rebecca kept leaving her post at the sink to bend anxiously over the basin and watch her progress, while Uncle Jerry offered advice from time to time. "You must 'a' laid all over the bridge, dearie," said Mrs. Cobb, "for the paint's not only on your elbows and yoke and waist, but it about covers your front breadth." As the garment began to look a little better, Rebecca's spirits took an upward turn, and at length she left it to dry in the fresh air, and went into the sitting room. "Have you a piece of paper, please?" asked Rebecca. "I'll copy out the poetry I was making while I was lying in the paint." Mrs. Cobb sat by her mending basket, and Uncle Jerry took down a gingham bag of strings and occupied himself in taking the snarls out of them, a favorite evening amusement with him. Rebecca soon had the lines copied in her round schoolgirl hand, making such improvements as occurred to her on sober second thought. The Two Wishes by Rebecca Randall. Two maidens by a river strayed, 'twas in the state of Maine. Rebecca was the darker one, the fairer Emma Jane. The fairer maiden said, I would my life were as the stream, so peaceful and so smooth and still, so pleasant and serene. I'd rather be a little drop in the great rushing fall. I'd never choose the quiet lake, 'twould not please me at all. It was the darker maiden spoke the words we have just stated. The maidens twain were simply friends, not sisters or related. But oh, alas, we may not have the things we hoped to gain. The quiet life may come to me, the rush to Emma Jane. She read it aloud, and the Cobbs thought it not only surpassingly beautiful, but a marvelous production. "I guess if that writer that lived on Congress Street in Portland could 'a' heard your poetry, he'd 'a' been astonished," said Mrs. Cobb. "If you ask me, I say this piece is as good as that one of his, 'Tell me not in mournful numbers,' and considerable clearer." "I never could fairly make out what mournful numbers was," remarked Mr. Cobb critically. "Then I guess you never studied fractions," flashed Rebecca. "See here, Uncle Jerry and Aunt Sarah, would you write another verse especially for a last one, as they usually do, one with thoughts in it to make a better ending?" "If you can grind 'em out just by turning the crank, why I should say the more the merrier, but I don't hardly see how you could have a better ending," observed Mr. Cobb. "It is horrid," grumbled Rebecca. "I ought not to have put that me in. I'm writing the poetry. Nobody ought to know it is me standing by the river. It ought to be Rebecca, or the darker maiden, and the rush to Emma Jane is simply dreadful. Sometimes I think I never will try poetry, it's so hard to make it come right, and other times it just says itself. I wonder if this would be better. But oh, alas, we may not gain the good for which we pray. The quiet life may come to one who likes it rather gay." I don't know whether that is worse or not. Now for a new last verse. In a few minutes the poetess looked up, flushed and triumphant. It was as easy as nothing. Just hear! And she read slowly with her pretty, pathetic voice. "Then if our lot be bright or sad, be full of smiles or tears, the thought that God has planned it so should help us bear the years." Mr. and Mrs. Cobb exchanged dumb glances of admiration. Indeed, Uncle Jerry was obliged to turn his face to the window and wipe his eyes furtively with the string bag. "How in the world did you do it?" Mrs. Cobb exclaimed. "Oh, it's easy," answered Rebecca. "The hymns at meeting are all like that. You see, there's a school newspaper printed at Wareham Academy once a month. Dick Carter says the editor is always a boy, of course, but he allows girls to try and write for it, and then chooses the best. Dick thinks I can be in it." "In it!" exclaimed Uncle Jerry. "I shouldn't be a bit surprised if you had to write the whole paper. And as for any boy editor, you could lick him writin', I bet you, with one hand tied behind you." "Can we have a copy of the poetry to keep in the family Bible?" inquired Mrs. Cobb respectfully. "Oh, would you like it?" asked Rebecca. "Yes, indeed. I'll do a clean, nice one, with violet ink and a fine pen. But I must go look at my poor dress." The old couple followed Rebecca into the kitchen. The frock was quite dry, and in truth it had been helped a little by Aunt Sarah's ministrations, but the colors had run in the rubbing, the pattern was blurred, and there were muddy streaks here and there. As a last resort, it was carefully smoothed with a warm iron, and Rebecca was urged to attire herself, that they might see if the spots showed as much when it was on. They did, most uncompromisingly, and to the dullest eye. Rebecca gave one searching look, and then said, as she took her hat from a nail in the entry, "I think I'll be going. Good night. If I've got to have a scolding, I want it quick and get it over." "Poor little unlucky misfortunate thing," sighed Uncle Jerry, as his eyes followed her down the hill. "I wish she could pay some attention to the ground under her feet, but I vow, if she was ourn, I'd let her slop paint all over the house before I could scold her. Here's her poetry she's left behind. Read it out again, Mother." "Land!" he continued, chuckling as he lighted his cob pipe. "I can just see the last flap of that boy editor's shirt tail as he legs it for the woods, while Rebecky settles down in his revolvin' chair. I'm puzzled as to what kind of a job editin' is exactly, but she'll find out, Rebecky will, and she'll just edit for all she's worth. 'The thought that God has planned it so should help us bear the years.' Land, Mother, that takes right holt, kind o' like the gospel. How do you suppose she thought that out?" "She couldn't have thought it out at her age," said Mrs. Cobb. "She must have just guessed it was that way. We know some things without being told, Jeremiah." Rebecca took her scolding, which she richly deserved, like a soldier. There was considerable of it, and Miss Miranda remarked, among other things, that so absent minded a child was sure to grow up into a driveling idiot. She was bidden to stay away from Alice Robinson's party, and doomed to wear her dress, stained and streaked as it was, until it was worn out. Aunt Jane, 6 months later, mitigated this martyrdom by making her a ruffled dimity pinafore, artfully shaped to conceal all the spots. She was blessedly ready with these mediations between the poor little sinner and the full consequences of her sin. When Rebecca had heard her sentence and gone to the north chamber, she began to think. If there was anything she did not wish to grow into, it was an idiot of any sort, particularly a driveling one, and she resolved to punish herself every time she incurred what she considered to be the righteous displeasure of her virtuous relative. She didn't mind staying away from Alice Robinson's. She had told Emma Jane it would be like a picnic in a graveyard, the Robinson house being as near an approach to a tomb as a house can manage to be. Children were commonly brought in at the back door, and requested to stand on newspapers while making their call, so that Alice was begged by her friends to receive in the shed or barn whenever possible. Mrs. Robinson was not only turrible neat, but also turrible close, so that the refreshments were likely to be peppermint lozenges and glasses of well water. After considering the relative values, as penances, of a piece of haircloth worn next the skin and a pebble in the shoe, she dismissed them both. The haircloth could not be found, and the pebble would attract the notice of the argus-eyed aunt, besides being a foolish bar to the activity of a person who had to do housework and walk a mile and a half to school. Her first experimental attempt at martyrdom had not been a distinguished success. She had stayed at home from the Sunday school concert, a function of which, in ignorance of more alluring ones, she was extremely fond. As a result of her desertion, 2 infants who relied upon her to prompt them (she knew all the verses of all the children better than they did themselves) broke down ignominiously. The class to which she belonged had to read a difficult chapter of Scripture in rotation, and the various members spent an arduous Sabbath afternoon counting out verses according to their seats in the pew, and practicing the ones that would inevitably fall to them. They were too ignorant to realize, when they were called upon, that Rebecca's absence would make everything come wrong, and the blow descended with crushing force when the Jebusites and Amorites, the Girgashites, Hivites, and Perizzites had to be pronounced by the persons of all others least capable of grappling with them. Self-punishment, then, to be adequate and proper, must begin, like charity, at home, and unlike charity, should end there too. Rebecca looked about the room vaguely as she sat by the window. She must give up something, and truth to tell, she possessed little to give, hardly anything but yes, that would do, the beloved pink parasol. She could not hide it in the attic, for in some moment of weakness she would be sure to take it out again. She feared she had not the moral energy to break it into bits. Her eyes moved from the parasol to the apple trees in the side yard, and then fell to the well curb. That would do. She would fling her dearest possession into the depths of the water. Action followed quickly upon decision, as usual. She slipped down in the darkness, stole out the front door, approached the place of sacrifice, lifted the cover of the well, gave one unresigned shudder, and flung the parasol downward with all her force. At the crucial instant of renunciation she was greatly helped by the reflection that she closely resembled the heathen mothers who cast their babes to crocodiles in the Ganges. She slept well and arose refreshed, as a consecrated spirit always should, and sometimes does. But there was great difficulty in drawing water after breakfast. Rebecca, chastened and uplifted, had gone to school. Abijah Flagg was summoned, lifted the well cover, explored, found the inciting cause of trouble, and with the help of Yankee wit succeeded in removing it. The fact was that the ivory hook of the parasol had caught in the chain gear, and when the first attempt at drawing water was made, the little offering of a contrite heart was jerked up, bent, its strong ribs jammed in the well side, and entangled with a twig root. It is needless to say that no sleight of hand performer, however expert, unless aided by the powers of darkness, could have accomplished this feat, but a luckless child in the pursuit of virtue had done it with a turn of the wrist. We will draw a veil over the scene that occurred after Rebecca's return from school. You who read may well be advanced in years. You may be gifted in rhetoric, ingenious in argument, but even you might quail at the thought of explaining the tortuous mental processes that led you into throwing your beloved pink parasol into Miranda Sawyer's well. Perhaps you feel equal to discussing the efficacy of spiritual self-chastisement with a person who closes her lips into a thin line and looks at you out of blank, uncomprehending eyes. Common sense, right, and logic were all arrayed on Miranda's side. When poor Rebecca, driven to the wall, had to avow the reasons lying behind the sacrifice of the sunshade, her aunt said, "Now see here, Rebecca, you're too big to be whipped, and I shall never whip you. But when you think you ain't punished enough, just tell me, and I'll make out to invent a little something more. I ain't so smart as some folks, but I can do that much, and whatever it is, it'll be something that won't punish the whole family, and make 'em drink ivory dust, wood chips, and pink silk rags with their water." End of chapter 12.
Chapter 13. Snow White, Rose Red. Just before Thanksgiving, the affairs of the Simpsons reached what might have been called a crisis, even in their family, which had been born and reared in a state of adventurous poverty and perilous uncertainty. Riverboro was doing its best to return the entire tribe of Simpsons to the land of its fathers, so to speak, thinking rightly that the town which had given them birth, rather than the town of their adoption, should feed them and keep a roof over their heads until the children were of an age for self-support. There was little to eat in the household, and less to wear, though Mrs. Simpson did, as always, her poor best. The children managed to satisfy their appetites by sitting modestly outside their neighbors' kitchen doors when meals were about to be served. They were not exactly popular favorites, but they did receive certain undesirable morsels from the more charitable housewives. Life was rather dull and dreary, however, and in the chill and gloom of November weather, with the vision of other people's turkeys bursting with fat, and other people's golden pumpkins and squashes and corn being garnered into barns, the young Simpsons groped about for some inexpensive form of excitement, and settled upon the selling of soap for a premium. They had sold enough to their immediate neighbors during the earlier autumn to secure a child's hand-cart, which, though very weak on its pins, could be trundled over the country roads. With large business sagacity and an executive capacity which must have been inherited from their father, they now proposed to extend their operations to a larger area and distribute soap to contiguous villages, if these villages could be induced to buy. The Excelsior Soap Company paid a very small return of any kind to its infantile agents, who were scattered through the state, but it inflamed their imaginations by the issue of circulars, with highly colored pictures of the premiums to be awarded for the sale of a certain number of cakes. It was at this juncture that Clara Bell and Susan Simpson consulted Rebecca, who threw herself solidly and wholeheartedly into the enterprise, promising her help and that of Emma Jane Perkins. The premiums within their possible grasp were 3: a bookcase, a plush reclining chair, and a banquet lamp. Of course the Simpsons had no books, and casting aside without thought or pang the plush chair, which might have been some use in a family of 7 persons, not counting Mr. Simpson, who ordinarily sat elsewhere at the town's expense, they warmed themselves rapturously in the vision of the banquet lamp, which speedily became to them more desirable than food, drink, or clothing. Neither Emma Jane nor Rebecca perceived anything incongruous in the idea of the Simpsons striving for a banquet lamp. They looked at the picture daily, and knew that if they themselves were free agents, they would toil, suffer, aye sweat, for the happy privilege of occupying the same room with that lamp through the coming winter evenings. It looked to be about 8 feet tall in the catalogue, and Emma Jane advised Clara Bell to measure the height of the Simpson ceilings, but a note in the margin of the circular informed them that it stood 2½ feet high, when set up in all its dignity and splendor on a proper table, $3 extra. It was only of polished brass, continued the circular, though it was invariably mistaken for solid gold, and the shade that accompanied it, at least it accompanied it if the agent sold 100 extra cakes, was of crinkled crepe paper printed in a dozen delicious hues, from which the joy-dazzled agent might take his choice. Seesaw Simpson was not in the syndicate. Clara Bell was rather a successful agent, but Susan, who could only say "thope," never made large returns, and the twins, who were somewhat young to be thoroughly trustworthy, could be given only a half-dozen cakes at a time, and were obliged to carry with them on their business trips a brief document stating the price per cake, dozen, and box. Rebecca and Emma Jane offered to go 2 or 3 miles in some one direction and see what they could do in the way of stirring up a popular demand for the Snow White and Rose Red brands, the former being devoted to laundry purposes, and the latter being intended for the toilet. There was a great amount of hilarity in the preparation for this event, and a long council in Emma Jane's attic. They had the soap company's circular from which to arrange a proper speech, and they had, what was still better, the remembrance of a certain patent medicine vendor's discourse at the Milltown Fair. His method, when once observed, could never be forgotten, nor his manner, nor his vocabulary. Emma Jane practiced it on Rebecca, and Rebecca on Emma Jane. "Can I sell you a little soap this afternoon? It is called the Snow White and Rose Red soap. 6 cakes in an ornamental box, only 20 cents for the white, 25 cents for the red. It is made from the purest ingredients, and if desired, could be eaten by an invalid with relish and profit." "Oh, Rebecca, don't let's say that," interposed Emma Jane hysterically. "It makes me feel like a fool." "It takes so little to make you feel like a fool, Emma Jane," rebuked Rebecca, "that sometimes I think that you must be one. I don't get to feeling like a fool so awfully easy. Now leave out that eating part if you don't like it, and go on." "The Snow White is probably the most remarkable laundry soap ever manufactured. Immerse the garments in a tub, lightly rubbing the more soiled portions with the soap. Leave them submerged in water from sunset to sunrise, and then the youngest baby can wash them without the slightest effort." "Babe, not baby," corrected Rebecca from the circular. "It's just the same thing," argued Emma Jane. "Of course it's just the same thing, but a baby has got to be called babe or infant in a circular, the same as it is in poetry. Would you rather say infant?" "No," grumbled Emma Jane. "Infant is worse even than babe. Rebecca, do you think we'd better do as the circular says, and let Elijah or Elisha try the soap before we begin selling?" "I can't imagine a babe doing a family wash with any soap," answered Rebecca. "But it must be true, or they would never dare to print it, so don't let's bother." "Oh, won't it be the greatest fun, Emma Jane? At some of the houses, where they can't possibly know me, I shan't be frightened, and I shall reel off the whole rigmarole, invalid, babe, and all. Perhaps I shall say even the last sentence, if I can remember it. We sound every chord in the great macrocosm of satisfaction." This conversation took place on a Friday afternoon at Emma Jane's house, where Rebecca, to her unbounded joy, was to stay over Sunday, her aunts having gone to Portland to the funeral of an old friend. Saturday being a holiday, they were going to have the old white horse, drive to North Riverboro 3 miles away, eat a 12 o'clock dinner with Emma Jane's cousins, and be back at 4 o'clock punctually. When the children asked Mrs. Perkins if they could call at just a few houses coming and going, and sell a little soap for the Simpsons, she at first replied decidedly in the negative. She was an indulgent parent, however, and really had little objection to Emma Jane amusing herself in this unusual way. It was only for Rebecca, as the niece of the difficult Miranda Sawyer, that she raised scruples. But when fully persuaded that the enterprise was a charitable one, she acquiesced. The girls called at Mr. Watson's store and arranged for several large boxes of soap to be charged to Clara Belle Simpson's account. These were lifted into the back of the wagon, and a happier couple never drove along the country road than Rebecca and her companion. It was a glorious Indian summer day, which suggested nothing of Thanksgiving, near at hand as it was. It was a rustly day, a scarlet and buff, yellow and carmine, bronze and crimson day. There were still many leaves on the oaks and maples, making a goodly show of red and brown and gold. The air was like sparkling cider, and every field had its heaps of yellow and russet good things to eat, all ready for the barns, the mills, and the markets. The horse forgot his 20 years, sniffed the sweet bright air, and trotted like a colt. Nokomis Mountain looked blue and clear in the distance. Rebecca stood in the wagon and apostrophized the landscape with sudden joy of living. Great, wide, beautiful, wonderful world, with the wonderful water round you curled, and the wonderful grass upon your breast, world, you are beautifully dressed. Dull Emma Jane had never seemed to Rebecca so near, so dear, so tried and true, and Rebecca, to Emma Jane's faithful heart, had never been so brilliant, so bewildering, so fascinating as in this visit together, with its intimacy, its freedom, and the added delights of an exciting business enterprise. A gorgeous leaf blew into the wagon. "Does color make you sort of dizzy?" asked Rebecca. "No," answered Emma Jane, after a long pause. "No, it don't. Not a mite." "Perhaps dizzy isn't just the right word, but it's nearest. I'd like to eat color and drink it and sleep in it. If you could be a tree, which one would you choose?" Emma Jane had enjoyed considerable experience of this kind, and Rebecca had succeeded in unstopping her ears, ungluing her eyes, and loosening her tongue, so that she could play the game after a fashion. "I'd rather be an apple tree in blossom, that one that blooms pink, by our pig pen." Rebecca laughed. There was always something unexpected in Emma Jane's replies. "I'd choose to be that scarlet maple just on the edge of the pond there," and she pointed with the whip. "Then I could see so much more than your pink apple tree by the pig pen. I could look at all the rest of the woods, see my scarlet dress in my beautiful looking glass, and watch all the yellow and brown trees growing upside down in the water. When I'm old enough to earn money, I'm going to have a dress like this leaf, all ruby color, thin, you know, with a sweeping train and roughly curly edges. Then I think I'll have a brown sash like the trunk of the tree, and where could I be green? Do they have green petticoats, I wonder? I'd like a green petticoat coming out now and then underneath to show what my leaves were like before I was a scarlet maple." "I think it would be awful homely," said Emma Jane. "I'm going to have a white satin with a pink sash, pink stockings, bronze slippers, and a spangled fan." End of chapter 13. Chapter 14. Mr. Aladdin. A single hour's experience of the vicissitudes incident to a business career clouded the children's spirits just the least bit. They did not accompany each other to the doors of their chosen victims, feeling sure that together they could not approach the subject seriously, but they parted at the gate of each house, the one holding the horse while the other took the soap samples, and interviewed anyone who seemed of a coming-on disposition. Emma Jane had disposed of 3 single cakes, Rebecca of 3 small boxes, for a difference in their ability to persuade the public was clearly defined at the start, though neither of them ascribed either success or defeat to anything but the imperious force of circumstances. Housewives looked at Emma Jane and desired no soap, listened to her description of its merits, and still desired none. Other stars in their courses governed Rebecca's doings. The people whom she interviewed either remembered their present need of soap, or reminded themselves that they would need it in the future, the notable point in the case being that lucky Rebecca accomplished, with almost no effort, results that poor little Emma Jane failed to attain by hard and conscientious labor. "It's your turn, Rebecca, and I'm glad, too," said Emma Jane, drawing up to a gateway and indicating a house that was set a considerable distance from the road. "I haven't got over trembling from the last place yet." A lady had put her head out of an upstairs window and called, "Go away, little girl. Whatever you have in your box, we don't want any. I don't know who lives here, and the blinds are all shut in front. If there's nobody at home, you mustn't count it, but take the next house as yours." Rebecca walked up the lane and went to the side door. There was a porch there, and seated in a rocking chair, husking corn, was a good-looking young man. Or was he middle-aged? Rebecca could not make up her mind. At all events, he had an air of the city about him, well-shaven face, well-trimmed mustache, well-fitting clothes. Rebecca was a trifle shy at this unexpected encounter, but there was nothing to be done but explain her presence, so she asked, "Is the lady of the house at home?" "I am the lady of the house at present," said the stranger, with a whimsical smile. "What can I do for you?" "Have you ever heard of would you like, do you need any soap?" queried Rebecca. "Do I look as if I did?" he responded unexpectedly. Rebecca dimpled. "I didn't mean that. I have some soap to sell. I would like to introduce to you a very remarkable soap, the best now on the market. It is called "Oh, I must know that soap," said the gentleman genially. "Made out of pure vegetable fats, isn't it?" "The very purest," corroborated Rebecca. "No acid in it?" "Not a trace." "And yet a child could do the Monday washing with it, and use no force?" "A babe," corrected Rebecca. "Oh, a babe, eh? That child grows younger every year instead of older. Wise child." This was great good fortune, to find a customer who knew all the virtues of the article in advance. Rebecca dimpled more and more, and at her new friend's invitation sat down on a stool at his side near the edge of the porch. The beauties of the ornamental box which held the rose red were disclosed, and the prices of both that and the snow white were unfolded. Presently she forgot all about her silent partner at the gate, and was talking as if she had known this grand personage all her life. "I'm keeping house today, but I don't live here," explained the delightful gentleman. "I'm just on a visit to my aunt, who has gone to Portland. I used to be here as a boy, and I am very fond of the spot." "I don't think anything takes the place of the farm where one lived when one was a child," observed Rebecca, nearly bursting with pride at having at last successfully used the indefinite pronoun in general conversation. The man darted a look at her and put down his ear of corn. "So you consider your childhood a thing of the past, do you, young lady?" "I can still remember it," answered Rebecca gravely, "though it seems a long time ago." "I can remember mine well enough, and a particularly unpleasant one it was," said the stranger. "So is mine," sighed Rebecca. "What was your worst trouble?" "Lack of food and clothes, principally." "Oh!" exclaimed Rebecca sympathetically, "mine was no shoes, and too many babies, and not enough books. But you're all right and happy now, aren't you?" she asked doubtfully, for though he looked handsome, well-fed and prosperous, any child could see that his eyes were tired, and his mouth was sad when he was not speaking. "I'm doing pretty well, thank you," said the man with a delightful smile. "Now tell me, how much soap ought I buy today?" "How much has your aunt on hand now?" suggested the very modest and inexperienced agent. "And how much would she need?" "Oh, I don't know about that. Soap keeps, doesn't it?" "I'm not certain," said Rebecca conscientiously, "but I'll look in the circular. It's sure to tell." And she drew the document from her pocket. "What are you going to do with the magnificent profits you get from this business?" "We are not selling for our own benefit," said Rebecca confidentially. "My friend, who is holding the horse at the gate, is the daughter of a very rich blacksmith, and doesn't need any money. I am poor, but I live with my aunts in a brick house, and of course they wouldn't like me to be a peddler. We are trying to get a premium for some friends of ours." Rebecca had never thought of alluding to the circumstances with her previous customers, but unexpectedly she found herself describing Mr. Simpson, Mrs. Simpson, and the Simpson family, their poverty, their joyless life, and their abject need of a banquet lamp to brighten their existence. "You needn't argue that point," laughed the man as he stood up to get a glimpse of the rich blacksmith's daughter at the gate. "I can see that they ought to have it if they want it, and especially if you want them to have it. I've known what it was myself to do without a banquet lamp. Now give me the circular and let's do some figuring. How much do the Simpsons lack at this moment? If they sell 200 more cakes this month and next, they can have the lamp by Christmas, Rebecca answered, and they can get a shade by summertime. But I'm afraid I can't help very much after today, because my Aunt Miranda may not like to have me. I see. Well, that's all right. I'll take 300 cakes, and that will give them shade and all. Rebecca had been seated on a stool very near to the edge of the porch, and at this remark she made a sudden movement, tipped over, and disappeared into a clump of lilac bushes. It was a very short distance, fortunately, and the amused capitalist picked her up, set her on her feet, and brushed her off. "You should never seem surprised when you have taken a large order," said he. "You ought to have replied, 'Can't you make it 350?' instead of capsizing in that unbusinesslike way." "Oh, I could never say anything like that!" exclaimed Rebecca, who was blushing crimson at her awkward fall. "But it doesn't seem right for you to buy so much. Are you sure you can afford it?" "If I can't, I'll save on something else," returned the jocose philanthropist. "What if your aunt shouldn't like the kind of soap?" queried Rebecca nervously. "My aunt always likes what I like," he returned. "Mine doesn't!" exclaimed Rebecca. "Then there's something wrong with your aunt." "Or with me," laughed Rebecca. "What is your name, young lady?" "Rebecca Rowena Randall, sir." "What?" with an amused smile. "Both? Your mother was generous." "She couldn't bear to give up either of the names, she says." "Do you want to hear my name?" "I think I know already," answered Rebecca with a bright glance. "I'm sure you must be Mr. Aladdin in the Arabian Nights. Oh, please, can I run down and tell Emma Jane? She must be so tired waiting, and she will be so glad." At the man's nod of assent, Rebecca sped down the lane, crying irrepressibly as she neared the wagon, "Oh, Emma Jane, Emma Jane, we are sold out!" Mr. Aladdin followed smilingly to corroborate this astonishing, unbelievable statement, lifted all their boxes from the back of the wagon, and taking the circular, promised to write to the Excelsior Company that night concerning the premium. "If you could contrive to keep a secret, you two little girls, it would be rather a nice surprise to have the lamp arrive at the Simpsons on Thanksgiving Day, wouldn't it?" he asked as he tucked the old lap robe cozily over their feet. They gladly assented, and broke into a chorus of excited thanks, during which tears of joy stood in Rebecca's eyes. "Oh, don't mention it!" laughed Mr. Aladdin, lifting his hat. "I was a sort of commercial traveler myself once, years ago, and I like to see the thing well done. Good-bye, Miss Rebecca Rowena. Just let me know whenever you have anything to sell, for I'm certain beforehand I shall want it." "Good-bye, Mr. Aladdin. I surely will," cried Rebecca, tossing back her dark braids delightedly and waving her hand. "Oh, Rebecca," said Emma Jane in an awestruck whisper, "he raised his hat to us, and we not 13. It'll be 5 years before we're ladies." "Never mind," answered Rebecca. "We are the beginnings of ladies, even now." "He tucked the lap robe round us, too," continued Emma Jane, in an ecstasy of reminiscence. "Oh, isn't he perfectly elegant? And wasn't it lovely of him to buy us out? And just think of having both the lamp and the shade for one day's work! Aren't you glad you wore your pink gingham now, even if Mother did make you put on flannel underneath? You do look so pretty in pink and red, Rebecca, and so homely in drab and brown." "I know it," sighed Rebecca. "I wish I was like you, pretty in all colors." And Rebecca looked longingly at Emma Jane's fat rosy cheeks, at her blue eyes, which said nothing, at her neat nose, which had no character, at her red lips, from between which no word worth listening to had ever issued. "Never mind," said Emma Jane comfortingly. "Everybody says you're awful bright and smart, and Mother thinks you'll be better looking all the time as you grow older. You wouldn't believe it, but I was a dreadful homely baby, and homely right along till just a year or two ago, when my red hair began to grow dark. What was that nice man's name?" "I never thought to ask!" ejaculated Rebecca. "Aunt Miranda would say that was just like me, and it is. But I called him Mr. Aladdin because he gave us a lamp. You know the story of Aladdin and the wonderful lamp?" "Oh, Rebecca, how could you call him a nickname the very first time you ever saw him?" "Aladdin isn't a nickname, exactly. Anyway, he laughed and seemed to like it." By dint of superhuman effort, and putting such a seal upon their lips as never mortals put before, the two girls succeeded in keeping their wonderful news to themselves, although it was obvious to all beholders that they were in an extraordinary and abnormal state of mind. On Thanksgiving the lamp arrived in a large packing box, and was taken out and set up by Seesaw Simpson, who suddenly began to admire and respect the business ability of his sisters. Rebecca had heard the news of its arrival, but waited until nearly dark before asking permission to go to the Simpsons, so that she might see the gorgeous trophy lighted and sending a blaze of crimson glory through its red crepe paper shade. End of Chapter 14.
Chapter 15. The Banquet Lamp. There had been company at the brick house to the bountiful Thanksgiving dinner which had been provided at 1 o'clock. The Burnham sisters, who lived between North Riverboro and Shaker Village, and who, for more than a quarter of a century, had come to pass the holiday with the Sawyers every year. Rebecca sat silent with a book after the dinner dishes were washed, and when it was nearly 5, asked if she might go to the Simpsons. "What do you want to run after those Simpson children for on a Thanksgiving Day?" queried Miss Miranda. "Can't you set still for once and listen to the improving conversation of your elders? You never can let well enough alone, but want to be forever on the move." "The Simpsons have a new lamp, and Emma Jane and I promised to go up and see it lighted, and make it a kind of party." "What under the canopy did they want of a lamp, and where did they get the money to pay for it? If Abner was at home, I should think he'd been swapping again," said Miss Miranda. "The children got it as a prize for selling soap," replied Rebecca. "They've been working for a year, and you know I told you that Emma Jane and I helped them the Saturday afternoon you were in Portland." "I didn't take notice, I s'pose, for it's the first time I ever heard the lamp mentioned." "Well, you can go for an hour and no more. Remember, it's as dark at 6 as it is at midnight. Would you like to take along some Baldwin apples? What have you got in the pocket of that new dress that makes it sag down so?" "It's my nuts and raisins from dinner," replied Rebecca, who never succeeded in keeping the most innocent action a secret from her Aunt Miranda. "They're just what you gave me on my plate." "Why didn't you eat them?" "Because I'd had enough dinner, and I thought if I saved these it would make the Simpsons' party better," stammered Rebecca, who hated to be scolded and examined before company. "They were your own, Rebecca," interposed Aunt Jane, "and if you chose to save them to give away, it is all right. We ought never to let this day pass without giving our neighbors something to be thankful for, instead of taking all the time to think of our own mercies." The Burnham sisters nodded approvingly as Rebecca went out, and remarked that they had never seen a child grow and improve so fast in so short a time. "There's plenty of room left for more improvement, as you'd know if she lived in the same house with you," answered Miranda. "She's into every nameable thing in the neighborhood, and not only into it, but generally at the head and front of it, especially when it's mischief. Of all the foolishness I ever heard of, that lamp beats everything. It's just like those Simpsons, but I didn't suppose the children had brains enough to sell anything." "One of them must have," said Miss Ellen Burnham, "for the girl that was selling soap at the Ladd's in North Riverboro was described by Adam Ladd as the most remarkable and winning child he ever saw." "It must have been Clara Belle, and I should never call her remarkable," answered Miss Miranda. "Has Adam been home again?" "Yes, he's been staying a few days with his aunt. There's no limit to the money he's making, they say, and he always brings presents for all the neighbors. This time it was a full set of furs for Mrs. Ladd, and to think we can remember the time he was a barefoot boy without 2 shirts to his back. It is strange he hasn't married, with all his money, and him so fond of children that he always has a pack of them at his heels." "There's hope for him still, though," said Miss Jane smilingly, "for I don't suppose he's more than 30." "He could get a wife in Riverboro if he was 130," remarked Miss Miranda. "Adam's aunt says he was so taken with the little girl that sold the soap, Clara Belle, did you say her name was, that he declared he was going to bring her a Christmas present," continued Miss Ellen. "Well, there's no accounting for tastes," exclaimed Miss Miranda. "Clara Belle's got cross eyes and red hair, but I'd be the last one to grudge her a Christmas present. The more Adam Ladd gives to her, the less the town'll have to." "Isn't there another Simpson girl?" asked Miss Lydia Burnham, "for this one couldn't have been cross-eyed. I remember Mrs. Ladd saying Adam remarked about this child's handsome eyes. He said it was her eyes that made him buy the 300 cakes. Mrs. Ladd has it stacked up in the shed chamber." 300 cakes!" ejaculated Miranda. "Well, there's one crop that never fails in Riverboro." "What's that?" asked Miss Lydia politely. "The fool crop," responded Miranda tersely, and changed the subject, much to Jane's gratitude, for she had been nervous and ill at ease for the last 15 minutes. What child in Riverboro could be described as remarkable and winning, save Rebecca? What child had wonderful eyes, except the same Rebecca? And finally, was there ever a child in the world who could make a man buy soap by the 100 cakes, save Rebecca? Meantime, the remarkable child had flown up the road in the deepening dusk, but she had not gone far before she heard the sound of hurrying footsteps, and saw a well-known figure coming in her direction. In a moment she and Emma Jane met and exchanged a breathless embrace. "Something awful has happened," panted Emma Jane. "Don't tell me it's broken!" exclaimed Rebecca. "No! Oh, no, not that. It was packed in straw, and every piece came out all right, and I was there, and I never said a single thing about your selling the 300 cakes that got the lamp, so we could be together when you told." "Our selling the 300 cakes," corrected Rebecca. "You did as much as I." "No, I didn't, Rebecca Randall. I just sat at the gate and held the horse." "Yes, but whose horse was it that took us to North Riverboro? And besides, it just happened to be my turn. If you had gone in and found Mr. Aladdin, you would have had the wonderful lamp given to you. But what's the trouble?" "The Simpsons have no kerosene and no wicks. I guess they thought a banquet lamp was something that lighted itself and burned without any help. Seesaw has gone to the doctor's to try if he can borrow a wick, and Mother let me have a pint of oil, but she says she won't give me any more. We never thought of the expense of keeping up the lamp, Rebecca." "No, we didn't. But let's not worry about that till after the party. I have a handful of nuts and raisins and some apples." "I have peppermints and maple sugar," said Emma Jane. "They had a real Thanksgiving dinner. The doctor gave them sweet potatoes and cranberries and turnips. Father sent a spare rib, and Mrs. Cobb a chicken and a jar of mincemeat." At 5:30 one might have looked in at the Simpsons' windows and seen the party at its height. Mrs. Simpson had let the kitchen fire die out, and had brought the baby to grace the festal scene. The lamp seemed to be having the party and receiving the guests. The children had taken the one small table in the house, and it was placed in the far corner of the room to serve as a pedestal. On it stood the sacred, the adored, the long desired object, almost as beautiful and nearly half as large as the advertisement. The brass glistened like gold, and the crimson paper shade glowed like a giant ruby. In the wide splash of light that it flung upon the floor sat the Simpsons, in reverent and solemn silence, Emma Jane standing behind them hand in hand with Rebecca. There seemed to be no desire for conversation; the occasion was too thrilling and serious for that. The lamp, it was tacitly felt by everybody, was dignifying the party and providing sufficient entertainment simply by its presence, being fully as satisfactory in its way as a pianola or a string band. "I wish Father could see it," said Clara Belle loyally. "If he once saw it, he'd want to thwop it," remarked Susan sagaciously. At the appointed hour, Rebecca dragged herself reluctantly away from the enchanting scene. "I'll turn out the lamp the minute I think you and Emma Jane are home," said Clara Belle. "And oh, I'm so glad you both live where you can see it shine from our windows. I wonder how long it will burn without being filled if I only keep it lit 1 hour every night." "You needn't put it out for want of kerosene," said Seesaw, coming in from the shed, "for there's a great keg of it settin' out there. Mr. Tubbs brought it over from North Riverboro, and said somebody sent an order by mail for it." Rebecca squeezed Emma Jane's arm, and Emma Jane gave a rapturous return squeeze. "It was Mr. Aladdin," whispered Rebecca as they ran down the path to the gate. Seesaw followed them, and handsomely offered to see them a piece down the road; but Rebecca declined his escort with such decision that he did not press the matter, but went to bed to dream of her instead. In his dreams flashes of lightning proceeded from both her eyes, and she held a flaming sword in either hand. Rebecca entered the home dining room joyously. The Burnham sisters had gone, and the two aunts were knitting. "It was a heavenly party!" she cried, taking off her hat and cape. "Go back and see if you have shut the door tight, and then lock it," said Miss Miranda in her usual austere manner. It was a heavenly party, reiterated Rebecca, coming in again, much too excited to be easily crushed. And oh, Aunt Jane, Aunt Miranda, if you'll only come into the kitchen and look out of the sink window, you can see the banquet lamp shining all red, just as if the Simpsons' house was on fire. And probably it will be before long, observed Miranda. I've got no patience with such foolish goings on. Jane accompanied Rebecca into the kitchen. Although the feeble glimmer which she was able to see from that distance did not seem to her a dazzling exhibition, she tried to be as enthusiastic as possible. "Rebecca, who was it that sold the 300 cakes of soap to Mr. Ladd in North Riverboro?" "Mr. who?" exclaimed Rebecca. "Mr. Ladd in North Riverboro." "Is that his real name?" queried Rebecca in astonishment. "I didn't make a bad guess," and she laughed softly to herself. "I asked you who sold the soap to Adam Ladd," resumed Miss Jane. "Adam Ladd! Then he's a lad, too! What fun!" "Answer me, Rebecca." "Oh, excuse me, Aunt Jane, I was so busy thinking. Emma Jane and I sold the soap to Mr. Ladd." "Did you tease him or make him buy it?" "Now, Aunt Jane, how could I make a big grown-up man buy anything if he didn't want to? He needed the soap dreadfully as a present for his aunt." Miss Jane still looked a little unconvinced, though she only said, "I hope your Aunt Miranda won't mind, but you know how particular she is, Rebecca, and I really wish you wouldn't do anything out of the ordinary without asking her first, for your actions are very queer." "There can't be anything wrong this time," Rebecca answered confidently. "Emma Jane sold her cakes to her own relations and to Uncle Jerry Cobb, and I went first to those new tenements near the lumber mill, and then to the Ladds. Mr. Ladd bought all we had and made us promise to keep the secret until the premium came, and I've been going about ever since as if the banquet lamp was inside of me, all lighted up and burning for every one to see." Rebecca's hair was loosened and falling over her forehead in ruffled waves. Her eyes were brilliant, her cheeks crimson. There was a hint of everything in the girl's face, of sensitiveness and delicacy as well as of ardor. There was the sweetness of the Mayflower and the strength of the young oak, but one could easily divine that she was one of the souls by nature pitched too high, by suffering plunged too low. "That's just the way you look, for all as if you did have a lamp burning inside of you," sighed Aunt Jane. "Rebecca, Rebecca, I wish you could take things easier, child. I am fearful for you sometimes." End of chapter 15.
Chapter 16. Seasons of Growth. The days flew by. As summer had melted into autumn, so autumn had given place to winter. Life in the brick house had gone on more placidly of late, for Rebecca was honestly trying to be more careful in the performance of her tasks and duties, as well as more quiet in her plays, and she was slowly learning the power of the soft answer in turning away wrath. Miranda had not, perhaps, quite as many opportunities in which to lose her temper, but it is only just to say that she had not fully availed herself of all that had offered themselves. There had been one outburst of righteous wrath occasioned by Rebecca's over-hospitable habits, which were later shown in a still more dramatic and unexpected fashion. On a certain Friday afternoon she asked her Aunt Miranda if she might take half her bread and milk upstairs to a friend. "What friend have you got up there, for pity's sake?" demanded Aunt Miranda. "The Simpson baby. Come to stay over Sunday. That is, if you're willing. Mrs. Simpson says she is. Shall I bring her down and show her? She's dressed in an old dress of Emma Jane's, and she looks sweet." "You can bring her down, but you can't show her to me. You can smuggle her out the way you smuggled her in, and take her back to her mother. Where on earth do you get your notions, borrowing a baby for Sunday?" "You're so used to a house without a baby, you don't know how dull it is," sighed Rebecca resignedly, as she moved towards the door. "But at the farm there was always a nice fresh one to play with and cuddle. There were too many, but that's not half as bad as none at all. Well, I'll take her back. She'll be dreadfully disappointed, and so will Mrs. Simpson. She was planning to go to Milltown." "She can unplan, then," observed Miss Miranda. "Perhaps I can go up there and take care of the baby," suggested Rebecca. "I brought her home, so't I could do my Saturday work just the same. You've got enough to do right here without any borrowed babies to make more steps. Now, no answering back. Just give the child some supper and carry it home where it belongs." "You don't want me to go down the front way? Hadn't I better just come through this room and let you look at her? She has yellow hair and big blue eyes. Mrs. Simpson says she takes after her father." Miss Miranda smiled acidly as she said she couldn't take after her father, for he'd take anything there was before she got there. Aunt Jane was in the linen closet upstairs, sorting out the clean sheets and pillow cases for Saturday, and Rebecca sought comfort from her. "I brought the Simpson baby home, Aunt Jane, thinking it would help us over a dull Sunday, but Aunt Miranda won't let her stay. Emma Jane has the promise of her next Sunday, and Alice Robinson the next. Mrs. Simpson wanted I should have her first, because I've had so much experience in babies. Come in and look at her sitting up in my bed, Aunt Jane. Isn't she lovely? She's the fat, gurgly kind, not thin and fussy like some babies, and I thought I was going to have her to undress and dress twice each day. Oh, dear! I wish I could have a printed book with everything set down in it that I could do, and then I wouldn't get disappointed so often." "No book could be printed that would fit you, Rebecca," answered Aunt Jane, "for nobody could imagine beforehand the things you'd want to do. Are you going to carry that heavy child home in your arms?" "No, I'm going to drag her in the little soap wagon. Come, baby, take your thumb out of your mouth and come to ride with Becky in your go-cart." She stretched out her strong young arms to the crowing baby, sat down in a chair with the child, turned her upside down unceremoniously, took from her waistband and scornfully flung away a crooked pin, walked with her, still in a highly reversed position, to the bureau, selected a large safety pin, and proceeded to attach her brief red flannel petticoat to a sort of shirt that she wore. Whether flat on her stomach or head down, heels in the air, the Simpson baby knew she was in the hands of an expert, and continued gurgling placidly, while Aunt Jane regarded the pantomime with a kind of dazed awe. "Bless my soul, Rebecca!" she ejaculated. "It beats all how handy you are with babies." "I ought to be. I've brought up 3 1/2 of 'em," Rebecca responded cheerfully, pulling up the infant Simpson's stockings. "I should think you'd be fonder of dolls than you are," said Jane. "I do like them, but there's never any change in a doll. It's always the same everlasting old doll, and you have to make believe it's cross or sick, or it loves you, or can't bear you. Babies are more trouble, but nicer." Miss Jane stretched out a thin hand with a slender, worn band of gold on the finger, and the baby curled her dimpled fingers round it and held it fast. "You wear a ring on your engagement finger, don't you, Aunt Jane? Did you ever think about getting married?" "Yes, dear, long ago." "What happened, Aunt Jane?" "He died just before." "Oh!" And Rebecca's eyes grew misty. "He was a soldier, and he died of a gunshot wound in a hospital down south." "Oh, Aunt Jane!" softly. "Away from you?" "No, I was with him." "Was he young?" "Yes, young and brave and handsome, Rebecca. He was Mr. Carter's brother, Tom." "Oh, I'm so glad you were with him. Wasn't he glad, Aunt Jane?" Jane looked back across the half forgotten years, and the vision of Tom's gladness flashed upon her, his haggard smile, the tears in his tired eyes, his outstretched arms, his weak voice saying, "Oh, Jenny, dear Jenny, I've wanted you so, Jenny." It was too much. She had never breathed a word of it before to a human creature, for there was no one who would have understood. Now, in a shamefaced way, to hide her brimming eyes, she put her head down on the young shoulder beside her, saying, "It was hard, Rebecca." The Simpson baby had cuddled down sleepily in Rebecca's lap, leaning her head back and sucking her thumb contentedly. Rebecca put her cheek down until it touched her aunt's gray hair, and softly patted her as she said, "I'm sorry, Aunt Jane." The girl's eyes were soft and tender, and the heart within her stretched a little and grew in sweetness and intuition and depth of feeling. It had looked into another heart, felt it beat, and heard it sigh, and that is how all hearts grow. Episodes like these enlivened the quiet course of everyday existence, made more quiet by the departure of Dick Carter, Living Perkins, and Huldah Meserve for Wareham, and the small attendance at the winter school, from which the younger children of the place stayed away during the cold weather. Life, however, could never be thoroughly dull or lacking in adventure to a child of Rebecca's temperament. Her nature was full of adaptability, fluidity, receptivity. She made friends everywhere she went, and snatched up acquaintances in every corner. It was she who ran to the shed door to take the dish to the meat man or fish man, she who knew the family histories of the itinerant fruit vendors and tin peddlers, she who was asked to take supper or pass the night with children in neighboring villages, children of whose parents her aunts had never so much as heard. As to the nature of these friendships, which seemed so many to the eye of the superficial observer, they were of various kinds, and while the girl pursued them with enthusiasm and ardor, they left her unsatisfied and heart-hungry. They were never intimacies such as are so readily made by shallow natures. She loved Emma Jane, but it was a friendship born of propinquity and circumstance, not of true affinity. It was her neighbor's amiability, constancy, and devotion that she loved, and although she rated these qualities at their true value, she was always searching beyond them for intellectual treasures, searching and never finding. For although Emma Jane had the advantage in years, she was still immature. Huldah Meserve had an instinctive love of fun which appealed to Rebecca. She also had a fascinating knowledge of the world, from having visited her married sisters in Milltown and Portland. But on the other hand, there was a certain sharpness and lack of sympathy in Huldah which repelled rather than attracted. With Dick Carter she could at least talk intelligently about lessons. He was a very ambitious boy, full of plans for his future, which he discussed quite freely with Rebecca. But when she broached the subject of her future, his interest sensibly lessened. Into the world of the ideal, Emma Jane, Huldah, and Dick alike never seemed to have peeped, and the consciousness of this was always a fixed gulf between them and Rebecca. Uncle Jerry and Aunt Sarah Cobb were dear friends of quite another sort, a very satisfying and perhaps a somewhat dangerous one. A visit from Rebecca always sent them into a twitter of delight. Her merry conversation and quaint comments on life in general fairly dazzled the old couple, who hung on her lightest word as if it had been a prophet's utterance. And Rebecca, though she had had no previous experience, owned to herself a perilous pleasure in being dazzling, even to a couple of dear humdrum old people like Mr. and Mrs. Cobb. Aunt Sarah flew to the pantry or cellar whenever Rebecca's slim little shape first appeared on the crest of the hill, and a jelly tart or a frosted cake was sure to be forthcoming. The sight of old Uncle Jerry's spare figure in its clean white shirt sleeves, whatever the weather, always made Rebecca's heart warm when she saw him peer longingly from the kitchen window. Before the snow came, many was the time he had come out to sit on a pile of boards at the gate, to see if by any chance she was mounting the hill that led to their house. In the autumn Rebecca was often the old man's companion while he was digging potatoes or shelling beans, and now, in the winter, when a younger man was driving the stage, she sometimes stayed with him while he did his evening milking. it is safe to say that he was the only creature in Riverboro who possessed Rebecca's entire confidence, the only being to whom she poured out her whole heart, with its wealth of hopes and dreams and vague ambitions. At the brick house she practiced scales and exercises, but at the Cobbs' cabinet organ she sang like a bird, improvising simple accompaniments that seemed to her ignorant auditors nothing short of marvelous. Here she was happy. Here she was loved. Here she was drawn out of herself and admired and made much of. But, she thought, if there was somebody who not only loved but understood, who spoke her language, comprehended her desires, and responded to her mysterious longings, perhaps in the big world of Wareham there would be people who thought and dreamed and wondered as she did. In reality, Jane did not understand her niece very much better than Miranda. The difference between the sisters was that while Jane was puzzled, she was also attracted, and when she was quite in the dark for an explanation of some quaint or unusual action, she was sympathetic as to its possible motive, and believed the best. A greater change had come over Jane than any other person in the brick house, but it had been wrought so secretly and concealed so religiously that it scarcely appeared to the ordinary observer. Life had now a motive utterly lacking before. Breakfast was not eaten in the kitchen, because it seemed worth while, now that there was 3 persons, to lay the cloth in the dining room. It was also a more bountiful meal than of yore, when there was no child to consider. The morning was made cheerful by Rebecca's start for school, the packing of the luncheon basket, the final word about umbrella, waterproof, or rubbers, the parting admonition, and the unconscious waiting at the window for the last wave of the hand. She found herself taking pride in Rebecca's improved appearance, her rounder throat and cheeks, and her better color. She was wont to mention the length of Rebecca's hair, and add a word as to its remarkable evenness and luster, at times when Mrs. Perkins grew too diffuse about Emma Jane's complexion. She threw herself wholeheartedly on her niece's side when it became a question between a crimson or a brown linsey woolsey dress, and went through a memorable struggle with her sister concerning the purchase of a red bird for Rebecca's black felt hat. No one guessed the quiet pleasure that lay hidden in her heart when she watched the girl's dark head bent over her lessons at night, nor dreamed of her joy in it certain quiet evenings when Miranda went to prayer meeting, evenings when Rebecca would read aloud Hiawatha or Barbara Frietchie, the Bugle Song or the Brook. Her narrow humdrum existence bloomed under the dews that fell from this fresh spirit. Her dullness brightened under the kindling touch of the younger mind, took fire from the vital spark of heavenly flame that seemed always to radiate from Rebecca's presence. Rebecca's idea of being a painter like her friend Miss Ross was gradually receding, owing to the apparently insuperable difficulties in securing any instruction. Her Aunt Miranda saw no wisdom in cultivating such a talent, and could not conceive that any money could ever be earned by its exercise. Hand-painted pictures were held in little esteem in Riverboro, where the cheerful chromo or the dignified steel engraving were respected and valued. There was a very slight hope that Rebecca might be allowed a few music lessons from Miss Morton, who played the church cabinet organ, but this depended entirely upon whether Mrs. Morton would decide to accept a hayrack in return for a year's instruction from her daughter. She had the matter under advisement, but a doubt as to whether or not she would sell or rent her hayfields kept her from coming to a conclusion. Music, in common with all other accomplishments, was viewed by Miss Miranda as a trivial, useless, and foolish amusement, but she allowed Rebecca an hour a day for practice on the old piano, and a little extra time for lessons, if Jane could secure them without payment of actual cash. The news from Sunnybrook Farm was hopeful rather than otherwise. Cousin Ann's husband had died, and John, Rebecca's favorite brother, had gone to be the man of the house to the widowed cousin. He was to have good schooling in return for his care of the horse and cow and barn, and what was still more dazzling, the use of the old doctor's medical library of 2 or 3 dozen volumes. John's whole heart was set on becoming a country doctor, with Rebecca to keep house for him, and the vision seemed now so true, so near, that he could almost imagine his horse plowing through snowdrifts on errands of mercy, or, less dramatic but none the less attractive, could see a physician's neat turncut trundling along the shady country roads, a medicine case between his, Dr. Randall's, feet, and Miss Rebecca Randall sitting in a black silk dress by his side. Hannah now wore her hair in a coil, and her dresses a trifle below her ankles, these concessions being due to her extreme height. Mark had broken his collar bone, but it was healing well. Little Mira was growing very pretty. There was even a rumor that the projected railroad from Temperance to Plumville might go near the Randall farm, in which case land would rise in value from nothing at all an acre to something at least resembling a price. Mrs. Randall refused to consider any improvement in their financial condition as a possibility. Content to work from sunrise to sunset to gain a mere subsistence for her children, she lived in their future, not in her own present, as a mother is wont to do when her own lot seems hard and cheerless. Chapter 17. Gray Days and Gold. When Rebecca looked back upon the year or two that followed the Simpsons' Thanksgiving party, she could see only certain milestones rising in the quiet pathway of the months. The first milestone was Christmas Day. It was a fresh crystal morning, with icicles hanging like dazzling pendants from the trees and a glaze of pale blue on the surface of the snow. The Simpsons' red barn stood out, a glowing mass of color in the white landscape. Rebecca had been busy for weeks before trying to make a present for each of the 7 persons at Sunnybrook Farm, a somewhat difficult proceeding on an expenditure of 50 cents, hoarded by incredible exertion. Success had been achieved, however, and the precious packet had been sent by post 2 days previous. Miss Sawyer had bought her niece a nice gray squirrel muff and tippet, which was even more unbecoming, if possible, than Rebecca's other articles of wearing apparel. But Aunt Jane had made her the loveliest dress of green cashmere, a soft, soft green like that of a young leaf. It was very simply made, but the color delighted the eye. Then there was a beautiful tatting collar from her mother, some scarlet mittens from Mrs. Cobb, and a handkerchief from Emma Jane. Rebecca herself had fashioned an elaborate tea cozy with the letter M in outline stitch, and a pretty frilled pincushion marked with a J for her 2 aunts, so that taken altogether the day would have been an unequivocal success had nothing else happened. But something else did. There was a knock at the door at breakfast time, and Rebecca, answering it, was asked by a boy if Miss Rebecca Randall lived there. On being told that she did, he handed her a parcel bearing her name, a parcel which she took like one in a dream and bore into the dining room. "It's a present, it must be," she said, looking at it in a dazed sort of way, "but I can't think who it could be from." "A good way to find out would be to open it," remarked Miss Miranda. The parcel, being untied, proved to have 2 similar packages within, and Rebecca opened with trembling fingers the one addressed to her. Anybody's fingers would have trembled. There was a case which, when the cover was lifted, disclosed a long chain of delicate pink coral beads, a chain ending in a cross made of coral rosebuds. A card with "Merry Christmas from Mr. Aladdin" lay under the cross. "Of all things!" exclaimed the two old ladies, rising in their seats. "Who sent it?" "Mr. Ladd," said Rebecca under her breath. "Adam Ladd? Well, I never! Don't you remember Ellen Burnham said he was going to send Rebecca a Christmas present?" "But I never supposed he'd think of it again," said Jane. "What's the other package?" It proved to be a silver chain with a blue enamel locket on it, marked for Emma Jane. That added the last touch, to have him remember them both. There was a letter also which ran: "Dear Rebecca Rowena, my idea of a Christmas present is something entirely unnecessary and useless. I have always noticed, when I give this sort of thing, that people love it, so I hope I have not chosen wrong for you and your friend. You must wear your chain this afternoon, please, and let me see it on your neck, for I am coming over in my new sleigh to take you both to drive. My aunt is delighted with the soap. Sincerely your friend, Adam Ladd." "Well, well!" cried Miss Jane. "Isn't that kind of him? He's very fond of children, Lyddy Burnham says. Now eat your breakfast, Rebecca, and after we've done the dishes you can run over to Emma's and give her her chain. What's the matter, child?" Rebecca's emotions seemed always to be stored, as it were, in adjoining compartments, and to be continually getting mixed. At this moment, though her joy was too deep for words, her bread and butter almost choked her, and at intervals a tear stole furtively down her cheek. Mr. Ladd called as he promised, and made the acquaintance of the aunts, understanding them both in 5 minutes as well as if he had known them for years. On a footstool near the open fire sat Rebecca, silent and shy, so conscious of her fine apparel and the presence of Aunt Miranda that she could not utter a word. It was one of her beauty days. Happiness, excitement, the color of the green dress, and the touch of lovely pink in the coral necklace had transformed the little brown wren, for the time, into a bird of plumage, and Adam Ladd watched her with evident satisfaction. Then there was the sleigh ride, during which she found her tongue and chattered away like any magpie, and so ended that glorious Christmas Day. And many a night thereafter did Rebecca go to sleep with the precious coral chain under her pillow, one hand always upon it to be certain that it was safe. Another milestone was the departure of the Simpsons from Riverboro, bag and baggage, the banquet lamp being their most conspicuous possession. It was delightful to be rid of Seesaw's hateful presence, but otherwise the loss of several playmates at one fell swoop made rather a gap in Riverboro's younger set, and Rebecca was obliged to make friends with the Robinson baby, he being the only long-clothes child in the village that winter. The faithful Seesaw had called at the side door of the brick house on the evening before his departure, and when Rebecca answered his knock, stammered solemnly, "Can I keep company with you when you grow up?" "Certainly not," replied Rebecca, closing the door somewhat too speedily upon her precocious swain. Mr. Simpson had come home in time to move his wife and children back to the town that had given them birth, a town by no means waiting with open arms to receive them. The Simpsons' moving was presided over by the village authorities, and somewhat anxiously watched by the entire neighborhood. But in spite of all precautions, a pulpit chair, several kerosene lamps, and a small stove disappeared from the church, and were successfully swapped in the course of Mr. Simpson's driving tour from the old home to the new. It gave Rebecca and Emma Jane some hours of sorrow to learn that a certain village in the wake of Abner Simpson's line of progress had acquired, through the medium of an ambitious young minister, a magnificent lamp for its new church parlors. No money changed hands in the operation, for the minister succeeded in getting the lamp in return for an old bicycle. The only pleasant feature of the whole affair was that Mr. Simpson, wholly unable to console his offspring for the loss of the beloved object, mounted the bicycle, and rode away on it, not to be seen or heard of again for many a long day. The year was notable also as being the one in which Rebecca shot up like a young tree. She had seemingly never grown an inch since she was 10 years old, but once she started, she attended to growing precisely as she did other things, with such energy that Miss Jane did nothing for months but lengthen skirts, sleeves, and waists. In spite of all the arts known to a thrifty New England woman, the limit of letting down and piecing down was reached at last, and the dresses were sent to Sunnybrook Farm to be made over for Jenny. There was another milestone, a sad one, marking a little grave under a willow tree at Sunnybrook Farm. Mira, the baby of the Randall family, died, and Rebecca went home for a fortnight's visit. The sight of the small, still shape that had been Mira, the baby who had been her special charge ever since her birth, woke into being a host of new thoughts and wonderments, for it is sometimes the mystery of death that brings one to a consciousness of the still greater mystery of life. It was a sorrowful homecoming for Rebecca. The death of Mira, the absence of John, who had been her special comrade, the sadness of her mother, the isolation of the little house, and the pinching economies that went on within it, all conspired to depress a child who was so sensitive to beauty and harmony as Rebecca. Hannah seemed to have grown into a woman during Rebecca's absence. There had always been a strange, unchildlike air about Hannah, but in certain ways she now appeared older than Aunt Jane, soberer and more settled. She was pretty, though in a colorless fashion, pretty and capable. Rebecca walked through all the old playgrounds and favorite haunts of her early childhood, all her familiar, her secret places, some of them known to John, some to herself alone. There was the spot where the Indian pipes grew, the particular bit of marshy ground where the fringed gentians used to be largest and bluest, the rock maple where she found the oriole's nest, the hedge where the field mice lived, the moss stump where the white toadstools were wont to spring up as if by magic, the hole at the root of the old pine where an ancient and honorable toad made his home. These were the landmarks of her childhood, and she looked at them as across an immeasurable distance. The dear little Sunny Brook, her chief companion after John, was sorry company at this season. There was no laughing water sparkling in the sunshine. In summer the merry stream had danced over white pebbles on its way to deep pools where it could be still and think. Now, like Mira, it was cold and quiet, wrapped in its shroud of snow. But Rebecca knelt by the brink, and putting her ear to the glaze of ice, fancied, where it used to be deepest, she could hear a faint tinkling sound. It was all right. Sunnybrook would sing again in the spring. Perhaps Mira, too, would have her singing time somewhere. She wondered where and how. In the course of these lonely rambles she was ever thinking of one subject. Hannah had never had a chance, never been freed from the daily care and work of the farm. She, Rebecca, had enjoyed all the privileges thus far. Life at the brick house had not been by any means a path of roses, but there had been comfort and the companionship of other children, as well as chances for study and reading. Riverboro had not been the world itself, but it had been a glimpse of it through a tiny peephole that was infinitely better than nothing. Rebecca shed more than one quiet tear before she could trust herself to offer up as a sacrifice that which she so much desired for herself. Then one morning, as her visit neared its end, she plunged into the subject boldly and said, "Hannah, after this term I'm going to stay at home and let you go away. Aunt Miranda has always wanted you, and it's only fair you should have your turn." Hannah was darning stockings, and she threaded her needle and snipped off the yarn before she answered, "No, thank you, Becky. Mother couldn't do without me, and I hate going to school." I can read and write and cipher as well as anybody now, and that's enough for me. I'd die rather than teach school for a living. The winter'll go fast, for Will Melville is going to lend me his mother's sewing machine, and I'm going to make white petticoats out of the piece of muslin Aunt Jane sent, and have 'em just solid with tucks. Then there's going to be a singing school and a social circle in Temperance after New Year's, and I shall have a real good time now I'm grown up. I'm not one to be lonesome, Becky," Hannah ended with a blush. "I love this place." Rebecca saw that she was speaking the truth, but she did not understand the blush till a year or two later. Chapter 18. Rebecca Represents the Family. There was another milestone. It was more than that. It was an event that made a deep impression in several quarters, and left a wake of smaller events in its train. This was the coming to Riverboro of the Reverend Amos Burch and wife, returned missionaries from Syria. The Aid Society had called its meeting for a certain Wednesday in March of the year in which Rebecca ended her Riverboro school days and began her studies at Wareham. It was a raw, blustering day, snow on the ground, and a look in the sky of more to follow. Both Miranda and Jane had taken cold, and decided that they could not leave the house in such weather; and this deflection from the path of duty worried Miranda, since she was an officer of the society. After making the breakfast table sufficiently uncomfortable, and wishing plaintively that Jane wouldn't always insist on being sick at the same time she was, she decided that Rebecca must go to the meeting in their stead. "You'll be better than nobody, Rebecca," she said flatteringly. "Your Aunt Jane shall write an excuse from afternoon school for you. You can wear your rubber boots and come home by the way of the meetin' house. This Mr. Burch, if I remember right, used to know your grandfather Sawyer, and stayed here once when he was candidatin'. He'll maybe look for us there, and you must just go and represent the family, and give him our respects. Be careful how you behave. Bow your head in prayer, sing all the hymns, but not too loud and bold. Ask after Miss Strout's boy. Tell everybody what awful colds we've got. If you see a good chance, take your pocket handkerchief and wipe the dust off the melodeon before the meetin' begins, and get 25 cents out of the sittin' room matchbox in case there should be a collection." Rebecca willingly assented. Anything interested her, even a village missionary meeting, and the idea of representing the family was rather intoxicating. The service was held in the Sunday school room, and although the Reverend Mr. Burch was on the platform when Rebecca entered, there were only a dozen persons present. Feeling a little shy and considerably too young for this assemblage, Rebecca sought the shelter of a friendly face, and seeing Mrs. Robinson in one of the side seats near the front, she walked up the aisle and sat beside her. "Both my aunts had bad colds," she said softly, "and sent me to represent the family." "That's Mrs. Burch on the platform with her husband," whispered Mrs. Robinson. "She's awful tanned up, ain't she? If you're goin' to save souls, seems like you have to part with your complexion. Eudoxy Morton ain't come yet. I hope to the land she will, or Miss Deacon Milliken'll pitch the tunes where we can't reach 'em with a ladder. Can't you pitch afore she gets her breath and clears her throat?" Mrs. Burch was a slim, frail little woman with dark hair, a broad, low forehead, and patient mouth. She was dressed in a well-worn black silk, and looked so tired that Rebecca's heart went out to her. "They're poor as Job's turkey," whispered Mrs. Robinson, "but if you give 'em anything, they turn right around and give it to the heathen. His congregation up to Parsonfield club together and give him that gold watch he carries. I suppose suppose he had handed that over, too, only heathens always tell time by the sun and don't need watches. Eudoxy ain't comin'. Now, for Massy's sake, Rebecca, do get ahead of Miss Deacon Milliken and pitch real low." The meeting began with prayer, and then the Reverend Mr. Birch announced, to the tune of Mendon, "Church of our God, I arise and shine, bright with the beams of truth divine. Then shall thy radiance stream afar, wide as the heathen nations are. Gentiles and kings thy light shall view, and shall admire and love thee, too. They come like clouds across the sky, as doves that to their windows fly." "Is there any one present who will assist us at the instrument?" he asked unexpectedly. Everybody looked at everybody else, and nobody moved. And then there came a voice out of a far corner saying informally, "Rebecca, why don't you?" It was Mrs. Cobb. Rebecca could have played Mendon in the dark, so she went to the melodeon and did so without any ado, no member of her family being present to give her self-consciousness. The talk that ensued was much the usual sort of thing. Mr. Birch made impassioned appeals for the spreading of the gospel, and added his entreaties that all who were prevented from visiting in person the peoples who sat in darkness should contribute liberally to the support of others who could. But he did more than this. He was a pleasant, earnest speaker, and he interwove his discourse with stories of life in a foreign land, of the manners, the customs, the speech, the point of view, even giving glimpses of the daily round, the common task of his own household, the work of his devoted helpmate, and their little group of children, all born under Syrian skies. Rebecca sat entranced, having been given the key of another world. Riverboro had faded, the Sunday school room, with Mrs. Robinson's red plaid shawl and Deacon Milliken's wig on crooked, the bare benches and torn hymn books, the hanging texts and maps, were no longer visible, and she saw blue skies and burning stars, white turbans and gay colors. Mr. Birch had not said so, but perhaps there were mosques and temples and minarets and date palms. What stories they must know, those children born under Syrian skies! Then she was called upon to play "Jesus Shall Reign Where'er the Sun." The contribution box was passed, and Mr. Birch prayed. As he opened his eyes and gave out the last hymn, he looked at the handful of people, at the scattered pennies and dimes in the contribution box, and reflected that his mission was not only to gather funds for the building of his church, but to keep alive in all these remote and lonely neighborhoods that love for the cause which was its only hope in the years to come. "If any of the sisters will provide entertainment," he said, "Mrs. Birch and I will remain among you to night and to morrow. In that event we could hold a parlor meeting. My wife and one of my children would wear the native costume. We would display some specimens of Syrian handiwork, and give an account of our educational methods with the children." These informal parlor meetings, admitting of questions or conversation, are often the means of interesting those not commonly found at church services, so I repeat, if any member of the congregation desires it and offers her hospitality, we will gladly stay and tell you more of the Lord's work. A pall of silence settled over the little assembly. There was some cogent reason why every sister there was disinclined for company. Some had no spare room. Some had a larder less well stocked than usual. Some had sickness in the family. Some were unequally yoked together with unbelievers who disliked strange ministers. Mrs. Birch's thin hands fingered her black silk nervously. Would no one speak? thought Rebecca, her heart fluttering with sympathy. Mrs. Robinson leaned over and whispered significantly, "The missionaries always used to be entertained at the brick house. Your grandfather never would let him sleep anywheres else when he was alive." She meant this for a stab at Miss Miranda's parsimony, remembering the 4 spare chambers closed from January to December. But Rebecca thought it was intended as a suggestion. If it had been a former custom, perhaps her aunts would want her to do the right thing, for what else was she representing the family? So delighted that duty lay in so pleasant a direction, she rose from her seat and said in the pretty voice and with the quaint manner that so separated her from all the other young people in the village, "My aunts, Miss Miranda and Miss Jane Sawyer, would be very happy to have you visit them at the brick house, as the ministers always used to do when their father was alive. They sent their respects by me." The respects might have been the freedom of the city, or an equestrian statue, when presented in this way, and the aunts would have shuddered could they have foreseen the manner of delivery. But it was vastly impressive to the audience, who concluded that Mirandy Sawyer must be making her way uncommonly fast to mansions in the sky, else what meant this abrupt change of heart? Mr. Burch bowed courteously, accepted the invitation in the same spirit in which it was offered, and asked Brother Milliken to lead in prayer. If the eternal ear could ever tire, it would have ceased long ere this to listen to Deacon Milliken, who had wafted to the throne of grace the same prayer, with very slight variations, for 40 years. Mrs. Perkins followed. She had several petitions at her command, good sincere ones too, but a little cut and dried, made of Scripture texts laboriously woven together. Rebecca wondered why she always ended at the most peaceful sessions with the form, "Do thou be with us, God of battles, while we strive onward like Christian soldiers, marching as to war." But everything sounded real to her today. She was in a devout mood, and many things Mr. Burch had said had moved her strangely. As she lifted her head, the minister looked directly at her and said, "Will our young sister close the service by leading us in prayer?" Every drop of blood in Rebecca's body seemed to stand still, and her heart almost stopped beating. Mrs. Cobb's excited breathing could be heard distinctly in the silence. There was nothing extraordinary in Mr. Burch's request. In his journeyings among country congregations he was constantly in the habit of meeting young members who had experienced religion, and joined the church when 9 or 10 years old. Rebecca was now 13. She had played the melodeon, led the singing, delivered her aunt's invitation with an air of great worldly wisdom, and he, concluding that she must be a youthful pillar of the church, called upon her with the utmost simplicity. Rebecca's plight was pathetic. How could she refuse? How could she explain she was not a member? How could she pray before all these elderly women? John Rogers at the stake hardly suffered more than this poor child, for the moment, as she rose to her feet, forgetting that ladies prayed sitting, while deacons stood in prayer. Her mind was a maze of pictures that the Reverend Mr. Burch had flung on the screen. She knew the conventional phraseology, of course. What New England child, accustomed to Wednesday evening meetings, does not? But her own secret prayers were different. However, she began slowly and tremulously. "Our Father who art in heaven, Thou art God in Syria just the same as in Maine. Over there today are blue skies and yellow stars and burning suns. The great trees are waving in the warm air, while here the snow lies thick under our feet. But no distance is too far for God to travel, and so He is with us here as He is with them there, and our thoughts rise to Him as doves that to their windows fly. We cannot all be missionaries, teaching people to be good. Some of us have not learned yet how to be good ourselves. But if Thy kingdom is to come, and Thy will is to be done on earth as it is in heaven, Everybody must try, and everybody must help, those who are old and tired, and those who are young and strong. The little children of whom we have heard, those born under Syrian skies, have strange and interesting work to do for thee, and some of us would like to travel in far lands and do wonderful, brave things for the heathen, and gently take away their idols of wood and stone. But perhaps we have to stay at home and do what is given us to do, sometimes even things we dislike. But that must be what it means in the hymn we sang when it talked about the sweet perfume that rises with every morning sacrifice. This is the way that God teaches us to be meek and patient, and the thought that He has willed it so should rob us of our fears and help us bear the years. Amen. Poor little ignorant, fantastic child! Her petition was simply a succession of lines from the various hymns and images the minister had used in his sermon. But she had her own way of recombining and applying these things, even of using them in a new connection, so that they had a curious effect of belonging to her. The words of some people might generally be written with a minus sign after them, the minus meaning that the personality of the speaker subtracted from rather than added to their weight. But Rebecca's words might always have borne the plus sign. The Amen said she sat down, or presumed she sat down, on what she believed to be a bench, and there was a benediction. In a moment or two, when the room ceased spinning, she went up to Mrs. Burch, who kissed her affectionately and said, "My dear, how glad I am that we are going to stay with you. Will 5:30 be too late for us to come? It is 3 now, and we have to go to the station for a valise and for our children. We left them there, being uncertain whether we should go back or stop here." Rebecca said that 5:30 was their supper hour, and then accepted an invitation to drive home with Mrs. Cobb. Her face was flushed, and her lip quivered in a way that Aunt Sarah had learned to know. So the homeward drive was taken almost in silence. The bleak wind and Aunt Sarah's quieting presence brought her back to herself, however, and she entered the brick house cheerily. Being too full of news to wait in the side entry to take off her rubber boots, she carefully lifted a braided rug into the sitting room and stood on that while she opened her budget. "There are your shoes warming by the fire," said Aunt Jane. "Slip them right on while you talk." Chapter 19. Deacon Israel's Successor. "It was a very small meeting, Aunt Miranda," began Rebecca, "and the missionary and his wife are lovely people, and they are coming here to stay all night and to-morrow with you. I hope you won't mind." "Coming here!" exclaimed Miranda, letting her knitting fall in her lap, and taking her spectacles off, as she always did in moments of extreme excitement. "Did they invite themselves?" "No," Rebecca answered. "I had to invite them for you. But I thought you'd like to have such interesting company. It was this way." "Stop your explainin' and tell me first when they'll be here. Right away?" "No, not for 2 hours. About 5:30. "Then you can explain, if you can, who gave you any authority to invite a passel of strangers to stop here overnight, when you know we ain't had any company for 20 years, and don't intend to have any for another 20, or at any rate while I'm the head of the house." "Don't blame her, Miranda, till you've heard her story," said Jane. "It was in my mind right along, if we went to the meeting, some such thing might happen on account of Mr. Burch knowing father." "The meeting was a small one," began Rebecca. "I gave all your messages, and everybody was disappointed you couldn't come, for the president wasn't there, and Mrs. Matthews took the chair, which was a pity, for the seat wasn't nearly big enough for her, and she reminded me of a line in a hymn we sang, 'Wide as the heathen nations are,' and she wore that kind of a beaver garden hat that always gets on one side. And Mr. Burch talked beautifully about the Syrian heathen, and the singing went real well, and there looked to be about 40 cents in the basket that was passed on our side, and that wouldn't save even a heathen baby, would it? Then Mr. Birch said if any sister would offer entertainment, they would pass the night and have a parlor meeting in Riverboro tomorrow, with Mrs. Birch in Syrian costume and lovely foreign things to show. Then he waited and waited, and nobody said a word. I was so mortified I didn't know what to do, and then he repeated what he said, and explained why he wanted to stay, and you could see he thought it was his duty. Just then Mrs. Robinson whispered to me and said the missionaries always used to go to the brick house when grandfather was alive, and that he never would let them sleep anywhere else. I didn't know you had stopped having them because no traveling ministers have been here, except just for a Sunday morning, since I came to Riverboro, so I thought I ought to invite them, as you weren't there to do it for yourself, and you told me to represent the family. What did you do? Go up and introduce yourself as folks was going out? No, I stood right up in meeting. I had to, for Mr. Birch's feelings were getting hurt and nobody speaking. So I said, my aunts, Miss Miranda and Miss Jane Sawyer, would be happy to have you visit at the brick house, just as the missionaries always did when their father was alive, and they sent their respects by me. Then I sat down, and Mr. Birch prayed for grandfather and called him a man of God, and thanked our Heavenly Father that his spirit was still alive in his descendants, that was you, and that the good old house where so many of the brethren had been cheered and helped, and from which so many had gone out strengthened for the fight, was still hospitably open for the stranger and wayfarer. Sometimes, when the heavenly bodies are in just the right conjunction, nature seems to be the most perfect art. The word or the deed coming straight from the heart without any thought of the effect seems inspired. A certain gateway in Miranda Sawyer's soul had been closed for years. Not all at once had it been done, but gradually, and without her full knowledge. If Rebecca had plotted for days, and with the utmost cunning, she could not have effected an entrance into that forbidden country, and now, unknown to both of them, the gate swung on its stiff and rusty hinges, and the favoring wind of opportunity opened it wider and wider as time went on. All things had worked together amazingly for good. The memory of old days had been evoked, and the daily life of a pious and venerated father called to mind. The Sawyer name had been publicly dignified and praised. Rebecca had comported herself as the granddaughter of Deacon Israel Sawyer should, and showed conclusively that she was not all Randall as had been supposed. Miranda was rather mollified by and pleased with the turn of events, although she did not intend to show it, or give anybody any reason to expect that this expression of hospitality was to serve for a precedent on any subsequent occasion. "Well, I see you did only what you was obliged to do, Rebecca," she said, "and you worded your invitation as nice as anybody could have done. I wish your Aunt Jane and me wasn't both so worthless with these colds, but it only shows the good of having a clean house with every room in order, whether open or shut, and enough victuals cooked so't you can't be surprised and belittled by anybody, whatever happens. There was half a dozen there that might have entertained the Birches as easy as not, if they hadn't a been too mean or lazy. Why didn't your missionaries come right along with you?" "They had to go to the station for their valise and their children." "Are there children?" groaned Miranda. "Yes, Aunt Miranda, all born under Syrian skies." "Syrian grandmother!" ejaculated Miranda, and it was not a fact. "How many?" "I didn't think to ask, but I will get 2 rooms ready, and if there are any over I'll take 'em into my bed," said Rebecca, secretly hoping that this would be the case. "Now, as you're both half sick, couldn't you trust me just once to get ready for the company? You can come up when I call. Will you?" "I believe I will," sighed Miranda reluctantly. "I'll lay down side of Jane in our bedroom and see if I can get strength to cook supper. It's 3:30. Don't you let me lay a minute past 5. I kep' a good fire in the kitchen stove. I don't know, I'm sure, why I should have baked a pot of beans in the middle of the week, but they'll come in handy. Father used to say there was nothin' that went right to the spot with returned missionaries like pork and beans and brown bread. Fix up the 2 south chambers, Rebecca." Rebecca, given a free hand for the only time in her life, dashed upstairs like a whirlwind. Every room in the brick house was as neat as wax, and she had only to pull up the shades, go over the floors with a whisk broom, and dust the furniture. The aunts could hear her scurrying to and fro, beating up pillows and feather beds, flapping towels, jingling crockery, singing meanwhile in her clear voice, "In vain with lavish kindness the gifts of God are strown, the heathen in his blindness bows down to wood and stone." She had grown to be a handy little creature, and tasks she was capable of doing at all she did like a flash, so that when she called her aunts at 5 o'clock to pass judgment, she had accomplished wonders. There were fresh towels on bureaus and washstands, the beds were fair and smooth, the pitchers were filled, and soap and matches were laid out. Newspaper, kindling, and wood were in the boxes, and a large stick burned slowly in each airtight stove. "I thought I'd better just take the chill off," she explained, "as they're right from Syria. And that reminds me, I must look it up in the geography before they get here." There was nothing to disapprove, so the 2 sisters went downstairs to make some slight changes in their dress. As they passed the parlor door, Miranda thought she heard a crackle and looked in. The shades were up, there was a cheerful blaze in the open stove in the front parlor, and a fire laid on the hearth in the back room. Rebecca's own lamp, her second Christmas present from Mr. Aladdin, stood on a marble-top table in the corner, the light that came softly through its iris-colored shade transforming the stiff and gloomy ugliness of the room into a place where one could sit and love one's neighbor. "For massy's sake, Rebecca," called Miss Miranda up the stairs, "did you think we'd better open the parlor?" Rebecca came out on the landing, braiding her hair. "We did on Thanksgiving and Christmas, and I thought this was about as great an occasion," she said. "I moved the wax flowers off the mantelpiece so they wouldn't melt, and put the shells, the coral, and the green stuffed bird on top of the wet knot so the children wouldn't ask to play with them. Brother Milliken's coming over to see Mr. Burch about business, and I shouldn't wonder if Brother and Sister Cobb happened in. Don't go down cellar, I'll be there in a minute to do the running." Miranda and Jane exchanged glances. "Ain't she the beatin'est creature that ever was born into the world?" exclaimed Miranda. "But she can turn off work when she's got a mind to." At 5:15 everything was ready, and the neighbors, those at least who were within sight of the brick house, a prominent object in the landscape when there was no leaves on the trees, were curious almost to desperation. Shades up in both parlors! Shades up in the 2 south bedrooms! And fires, if human vision was to be relied upon, fires in about every room! If it had not been for the kind offices of a lady who had been at the meeting, and who charitably called in at 1 or 2 houses and explained the reason of all this preparation, there would have been no sleep in many families. The missionary party arrived promptly, and there were but 2 children, 7 or 8 having been left with the Brethren in Portland, to diminish traveling expenses. Jane escorted them all upstairs, while Miranda watched the cooking of the supper. But Rebecca promptly took the 2 little girls away from their mother, divested them of their wraps, smoothed their hair, and brought them down to the kitchen to smell the beans. There was a bountiful supper, and the presence of the young people robbed it of all possible stiffness. Aunt Jane helped clear the table and put away the food, while Miranda entertained in the parlor. But Rebecca and the infant Burches washed the dishes and held high carnival in the kitchen, doing only trifling damage, breaking a cup and plate that had been cracked before, emptying a silver spoon with some dishwater out of the back door, an act never permitted at the brick house, and putting coffee grounds in the sink, all evidences of crime having been removed by Rebecca, and damages repaired in all possible cases. The three entered the parlor, where Mr. and Mrs. Cobb and Deacon and Mrs. Milliken had already appeared. It was such a pleasant evening. Occasionally they left the heathen in his blindness bowing down to wood and stone, not for long, but just to give themselves and him time enough to breathe. And then the Birches told strange, beautiful, marvelous things. The two smaller children sang together, and Rebecca, at the urgent request of Mrs. Birch, seated herself at the tinkling old piano and gave Wild Roved an Indian Girl Bright Alafarada with considerable spirit and style. At 8 o'clock she crossed the room, handed a palm leaf fan to her Aunt Miranda, ostensibly that she might shade her eyes from the lamplight, but it was a piece of strategy that gave her an opportunity to whisper, "How about cookies?" "Do you think it's worth while?" sibilated Miss Miranda in answer. "The Perkinsons always do." "All right. You know where they be." Rebecca moved quietly towards the door, and the young Birches cataracted after her as if they could not bear a second's separation. In 5 minutes they returned, the little ones bearing plates of thin caraway wafers, hearts, diamonds, and circles, daintily sugared and flecked with caraway seed, raised in the garden behind the house. These were a speciality of Miss Jane's, and Rebecca carried a tray with 6 tiny crystal glasses filled with dandelion wine, for which Miss Miranda had been famous in years gone by. Old Deacon Israel had always had it passed, and he had bought the glasses himself in Boston. Miranda admired them greatly, not only for their beauty, but because they held so little. Before their advent, the dandelion wine had been served in sherry glasses. As soon as these refreshments, commonly called a collation in Riverboro, had been genteelly partaken of, Rebecca looked at the clock, rose from her chair in the children's corner, and said cheerfully, "Come, time for little missionaries to be in bed." Everybody laughed at this, the big missionaries most of all, as the young people shook hands and disappeared with Rebecca. Chapter
20. A Change of Heart. "That niece of yours is the most remarkable girl I have seen in years," said Mr. Birch when the door closed. "She seems to be turning out smart enough lately, but she's considerable headless," answered Miranda, "and most too lively." "We must remember that it is deficient, not excessive vitality that makes the greatest trouble in this world," returned Mr. Birch. "She'd make a wonderful missionary," said Mrs. Birch, "with her voice and her magnetism and her gift of language." "If I was to say which of the two she was best adapted for, I'd say she'd make a better heathen," remarked Miranda curtly. "My sister don't believe in flattering children," hastily interpolated Jane, glancing towards Mrs. Birch, who seemed somewhat shocked, and was about to open her lips to ask if Rebecca was not a professor. Mrs. Cobb had been looking for this question all the evening, and dreading some allusion to her favourite as gifted in prayer. She had taken an instantaneous and illogical dislike to the Reverend Mr. Birch in the afternoon, because he called upon Rebecca to lead. She had seen the pallor creep into the girl's face, the hunted look in her eyes, and the trembling of the lashes on her cheeks, and realized the ordeal through which she was passing. Her prejudice against the minister had relaxed under his genial talk and presence, but feeling that Mrs. Birch was about to tread on dangerous ground, she hastily asked her if one had to change cars many times, going from Riverboro to Syria. She felt that it was not a particularly appropriate question, but it served her turn. Deacon Milliken, meantime, said to Miss Sawyer, "Mirandy, do you know who Rebecca reminds me of?" "I can guess pretty well," she replied. "Then you've noticed it too?" I thought at first, seein' she favoured her father so on the outside, that she was the same all through, but she ain't. She's like your father, Israel Sawyer." "I don't know how you make that out," said Miranda, thoroughly astonished. "It struck me this afternoon when she got up to give your invitation in meeting. It was kinder curious, but she sat in the same seat he used to when he was leader at the Sabbath school. You know, his old way of holding his chin up and throwing his head back a leetle when he got up to say anything. Well, she done the very same thing. There was more'n one spoke of it. The callers left before 9, and at that hour, an impossibly dissipated one for the brick house, the family retired for the night. As Rebecca carried Mrs. Birch's candle upstairs and found herself thus alone with her for a minute, she said shyly, "Will you please tell Mr. Birch that I am not a member of the church? I didn't know what to do when he asked me to pray this afternoon. I hadn't the courage to say I had never done it out loud and didn't know how. I couldn't think, and I was so frightened I wanted to sink into the floor. It seemed bold and wicked for me to pray before all those old church members and make believe I was better than I really was. But then again, wouldn't God think I was wicked not to be willing to pray when a minister asked me to?" The candlelight fell on Rebecca's flushed, sensitive face. Mrs. Birch bent and kissed her good night. "Don't be troubled," she said. "I'll tell Mr. Birch, and I guess God will understand." Rebecca waked before 6 the next morning, so full of household cares that sleep was impossible. She went to the window and looked out. It was still dark, and a blustering, boisterous day. "Aunt Jane told me she should get up at 6:30 and have breakfast at 7:30, she thought. "But I dare say they are both sick with their colds, and Aunt Miranda will be fidgety with so many in the house. I believe I'll creep down and start things for a surprise." She put on a wadded wrapper and slippers and stole quietly down the tabooed front stairs, carefully closed the kitchen door behind her so that no noise should waken the rest of the household, busied herself for half an hour with the early morning routine she knew so well, and then went back to her room to dress before calling the children. Contrary to expectation, Miss Jane, who the evening before felt better than Miranda, grew worse in the night, and was wholly unable to leave her bed in the morning. Miranda grumbled without ceasing during the progress of her hasty toilet, blaming everybody in the universe for the afflictions she had borne and was to bear during the day. She even castigated the missionary board that had sent the Birches to Syria, and gave it as her unbiased opinion that those who went to foreign lands for the purpose of saving heathen should stay there and save 'em and not go gallivanting all over the earth with a passel of children, visiting folks that didn't want 'em and never asked them. Jane lay anxiously and restlessly in bed with a feverish headache, wondering how her sister could manage without her. Miranda walked stiffly through the dining room, tying a shawl over her head to keep the draughts away, intending to start the breakfast fire and then call Rebecca down, set her to work, and tell her, meanwhile, a few plain facts concerning the proper way of representing the family at a missionary meeting. She opened the kitchen door and stared vaguely about her, wondering whether she had strayed into the wrong house by mistake. The shades were up, and there was a roaring fire in the stove. The tea kettle was singing and bubbling as it sent out a cloud of steam, and pushed over its capacious nose was a half sheet of notepaper with "Compliments of Rebecca" scrawled on it. The coffee pot was scalding, the coffee was measured out in a bowl, and broken eggshells for the settling process were standing near. The cold potatoes and corned beef were in the wooden tray, and "Regards of Rebecca" stuck on the chopping knife. The brown loaf was out, the white loaf was out, the toast rack was out, the doughnuts were out, the milk was skimmed, the butter had been brought from the dairy. Miranda removed the shawl from her head and sank into the kitchen rocker, ejaculating under her breath, "She is the beatin'est child. I declare she's all Sawyer." The day and the evening passed off with credit and honour to everybody concerned, even to Jane, who had the discretion to recover instead of growing worse, and acting as a damper to the general enjoyment. Birch is left with lively regrets, and the little missionaries, bathed in tears, swore eternal friendship with Rebecca, who pressed into their hands at parting a poem composed before breakfast. To Martha and Mary Birch. Born under Syrian skies, 'neath hotter suns than ours, the children grew and bloomed like little tropic flowers. When they first saw the light, 'twas in a heathen land, not Greenland's icy mountains, nor India's coral strand, but some mysterious country where men are nearly black, and where of true religion there is a painful lack. Then let us haste in helping the missionary board, seek dark-skinned unbelievers, and teach them of their Lord. Rebecca Rowena Randall. It can readily be seen that this visit of the returned missionaries to Riverboro was not without somewhat far-reaching results. Mr. and Mrs. Birch themselves looked back on it as one of the rarest pleasures of their half-year at home. The neighbourhood extracted considerable eager conversation from it, argument, rebuttal, suspicion, certainty, retrospect, and prophecy. Deacon Milliken gave $10 towards the conversion of Syria to Congregationalism, and Mrs. Milliken had a spell of sickness over her husband's rash generosity. It would be pleasant to state that Miranda Sawyer was an entirely changed woman afterwards, but that is not the fact. The tree that has been getting a twist for 20 years cannot be straightened in the twinkling of an eye. It is certain, however, that although the difference to the outward eye was very small, it nevertheless existed, and she was less censorious in her treatment of Rebecca, less harsh in her judgments, more hopeful of final salvation for her. This had come about largely from her sudden vision that Rebecca, after all, inherited something from the Sawyer side of the house, instead of belonging, mind, body, and soul, to the despised Randall stock. Everything that was interesting in Rebecca, and every evidence of power, capability, or talent afterwards displayed by her, Miranda ascribed to the brick house training, and this gave her a feeling of honest pride, the pride of a master workman who has built success out of the most unpromising material. But never, to the very end, even when the waning of her bodily strength relaxed her iron grip and weakened her power of repression, never once did she show that pride, or make a single demonstration of affection. Poor, misplaced, belittled Lorenzo de Medici Randall, thought ridiculous and good for naught by his associates, because he resembled them in nothing. If Riverboro could have been suddenly emptied into a larger community, with different and more flexible opinions, he was, perhaps, the only personage in the entire population who would have attracted the smallest attention. It was fortunate for his daughter that she had been dowered with a little practical ability from her mother's family, but if Lorenzo had never done anything else in the world, he might have glorified himself that he had prevented Rebecca from being all Sawyer. Failure as he was, complete and entire, he had generously handed down to her all that was best in himself, and prudently retained all that was unworthy. Few fathers are capable of such delicate discrimination. The brick house did not speedily become a sort of wayside inn, a place of innocent revelry and joyous welcome. But the missionary company was an entering wedge, and Miranda allowed one spare bed to be made up, in case anything should happen, while the crystal glasses were kept on the second from the top, instead of the top shelf, in the china closet. Rebecca had had to stand on a chair to reach them, now she could do it by stretching, and this is symbolic of the way in which she unconsciously scaled the walls of Miss Miranda's dogmatism and prejudice. Miranda went so far as to say that she wouldn't mind if the Birches came every once in a while, but she was afraid he'd spread abroad the fact of his visit, and missionaries' families would be underfoot the whole continual time. As a case in point, she gracefully cited the fact that if a tramp got a good meal at anybody's back door, 'twas said that he'd leave some kind of a sign so that all other tramps would know where they were likely to receive the same treatment. It is to be feared that there is some truth in this homely illustration, and Miss Miranda's dread as to her future responsibilities had some foundation, though not of the precise sort she had in mind. The soul grows into lovely habits as easily as into ugly ones, and the moment a life begins to blossom into beautiful words and deeds, that moment a new standard of conduct is established, and your eager neighbours look to you for a continuous manifestation of the good cheer, the sympathy, the ready wit, the comradeship, or the inspiration you once showed yourself capable of. Bear figs for a season or two, and the world outside the orchard is very unwilling you should bear thistles. The effect of the Birches' visit on Rebecca is not easily described. Nevertheless, as she looked back upon it from the vantage ground of after years, she felt that the moment when Mr. Birch asked her to lead in prayer marked an epoch in her life. If you have ever observed how courteous and gracious and mannerly you feel when you don a beautiful new frock, if you have ever noticed the feeling of reverence stealing over you when you close your eyes, clasp your hands, and bow your head, if you have ever watched your sense of repulsion towards a fellow creature melt a little under the exercise of daily politeness, you may understand how the adoption of the outward and visible sign has some strange influence in developing the inward and spiritual state of which it is the expression. It is only when one has grown old and dull that the soul is heavy and refuses to rise. The young soul is ever winged. A breath stirs it to an upward flight. Rebecca was asked to bear witness to a state of mind, or feeling, of whose existence she had only the vaguest consciousness. She obeyed, and as she uttered words, they became true in the uttering. As she voiced aspirations, they settled into realities. As, dove that to its window flies, her spirit soared towards a great light, dimly discovered at first, but brighter as she came closer to it. To become sensible of oneness with the divine heart before any sense of separation has been felt, this is surely the most beautiful way for the child to find God. End of chapter 20.
Chapter 21. The skyline widens. The time so long and eagerly awaited for had come, and Rebecca was a student at Wareham. Persons who had enjoyed the social bewilderments and advantages of foreign courts, or had mingled freely in the intellectual circles of great universities, might not have looked upon Wareham as an extraordinary experience. But it was as much of an advance upon Riverboro as that village had been upon Sunnybrook Farm. Rebecca's intention was to complete the 4 years' course in 3, as it was felt by all the parties concerned that when she had attained the ripe age of 17 she must be ready to earn her own living and help in the education of the younger children. While she was wondering how this could be successfully accomplished, some of the other girls were cogitating as to how they could meander through the 4 years and come out at the end knowing no more than at the beginning. This would seem a difficult, well nigh an impossible task, but it can be achieved, and has been, at other seats of learning than modest little Wareham. Rebecca was to go and fro on the cars daily from September to Christmas, and then board in Wareham during the 3 coldest months. Emma Jane's parents had always thought that a year or two in the Edgewood High School, 3 miles from Riverboro, would serve every purpose for their daughter, and send her into the world with as fine an intellectual polish as she could well sustain. Emma Jane had either heartily concurred in this opinion, for if there was any one thing that she detested, it was the learning of lessons. One book was as bad as another in her eyes, and she could have seen the libraries of the world sinking into ocean's depths, and have eaten her dinner cheerfully the while. but matters assumed a different complexion when she was sent to Edgewood and Rebecca to Wareham. She bore it for a week. 7 endless days of absence from the beloved object, whom she could see only in the evenings when both were busy with their lessons. Sunday offered an opportunity to put the matter before her father, who proved obdurate. He didn't believe in education, and thought she had full enough already. He never intended to keep up blacksmithing for good when he leased his farm and came into Riverboro, but proposed to go back to it presently, and by that time Emma Jane would have finished school, and would be ready to help her mother with the dairy work. Another week passed. Emma Jane pined visibly and audibly. Her colour faded, and her appetite, at table, dwindled almost to nothing. Her mother alluded plaintively to the fact that the Perkinses had a habit of going into declines, that she'd always feared that Emma Jane's complexion was too beautiful to be healthy, that some man would be proud of having an ambitious daughter, and be glad to give her the best advantages, that she feared the daily journeys to Edgewood were going to be too much for her own health, and Mr. Perkins would have to hire a boy to drive Emma Jane, and finally that when a girl had such a passion for learning as Emma Jane, it seemed almost like wickedness to cross her will. Mr. Perkins bore this for several days, until his temper, digestion, and appetite were all sensibly affected. Then he bowed his head to the inevitable, and Emma Jane flew, like a captive set free, to the loved one's bower. Neither did her courage flag, although it was put to terrific tests when she entered the academic groves of Wareham. She passed in only 2 subjects, but went cheerfully into the preparatory department with her 5 conditions, intending to let the stream of education play gently over her mental surfaces, and not get any wetter than she could help. It is not possible to blink the truth that Emma Jane was dull, but a dogged, unswerving loyalty, and the gift of devoted, unselfish loving, these, after all, are talents of a sort, and may possibly be of as much value in the world as a sense of numbers or faculty for languages. Wareham was a pretty village with a broad main street, shaded by great maples and elms. It had an apothecary, a blacksmith, a plumber, several shops of one sort and another, 2 churches, and many boarding houses, but all its interests gathered about its seminary and its academic. These seats of learning were neither better nor worse than others of their kind, but differed much in efficiency, according as the principal, who chanced to be as the head, was a man of power and inspiration, or the reverse. There were boys and girls gathered from all parts of the country and state, and they were of every kind and degree as to birth, position in the world, wealth, or poverty. There was an opportunity for a deal of foolish and imprudent behaviour, but on the whole surprisingly little advantage was taken of it. Among the 3rd and 4th year students there was a certain amount of going to and from the trains in couples, some carrying of heavy books up the hill by the sterner sex for their feminine schoolmates, and occasional bursts of silliness on the part of the heedless and precocious girls, among whom was Huldah Meserve. She was friendly enough with Emma Jane and Rebecca, but grew less and less intimate as time went on. She was extremely pretty, with a profusion of auburn hair and a few very tiny freckles, to which she constantly alluded, as no one could possibly detect them without noting her porcelain skin and her curling lashes. She had merry eyes, a somewhat too plump figure for her years, and was popularly supposed to have a fascinating way with her. Riverboro being poorly furnished with beaux, she intended to have as good a time during her 4 years at Wareham as circumstances would permit. Her idea of pleasure was an ever-changing circle of admirers to fetch and carry for her, the more publicly the better, incessant chaff and laughter, and vivacious conversation, made eloquent and effective by arch looks and telling glances. She had a habit of confiding her conquests to less fortunate girls, and bewailing the incessant havoc and damage she was doing, a damage she avowed herself as innocent of, in intention, as any new-born lamb. It does not take much of this sort of thing to wreck an ordinary friendship, so before long Rebecca and Emma Jane sat in one end of the railway train in going to and from Riverboro, and Huldah occupied the other with her court. Sometimes this was brilliant beyond words, including a certain youthful Monte Cristo, who on Fridays expended 30 cents on a round-trip ticket and travelled from Wareham to Riverboro merely to be near Huldah. Sometimes, too, the circle was reduced to the popcorn and peanut boy of the train, who seemed to serve every purpose in default of better game. Rebecca was in the normally unconscious state that belonged to her years. Boys were good comrades, but not more. She liked reciting in the same class with them. Everything seemed to move better, but from vulgar and precocious flirtations she was protected by her ideals. There was little in the lads she had met thus far to awaken her fancy, for it habitually fed on better meat. Huldah's schoolgirl's romances, with their wealth of commonplace detail, were not the stuff her dreams were made of, when dreams did flutter across the sensitive plate of her mind. Among the teachers at Wareham was one who influenced Rebecca profoundly, Miss Emily Maxwell, with whom she studied English literature and composition. Miss Maxwell, as the niece of one of Maine's ex-governors and the daughter of one of Boydon's professors, was the most remarkable personality in Wareham, and that her few years of teaching happened to be in Rebecca's time was the happiest of all chances. There was no indecision or delay in the establishment of their relations. Rebecca's heart flew like an arrow to its mark, and her mind, meeting its superior, settled at once into an abiding attitude of respectful homage. It was rumoured that Miss Maxwell wrote, which word, when uttered in a certain tone, was understood to mean not that a person had command of penmanship, Spencerian or otherwise, but that she had appeared in print. "You like her? She writes," whispered Huldah to Rebecca the first morning at prayers, where the faculty sat in an opposing row on the front seats. "She writes, and I call her stuck up." Nobody seemed possessed of exact information with which to satisfy the hungry mind, but there was believed to be at least one person in existence who had seen with his own eyes an essay by Miss Maxwell in a magazine. This height of achievement made Rebecca somewhat shy of her, but she looked her admiration, something that most of the class could never do with the unsatisfactory organs of vision given them by Mother Nature. Miss Maxwell's glance was always meeting a pair of eager dark eyes when she said anything particularly good. She looked for approval to the corner of the second bench, where every shade of feeling she wished to evoke was reflected on a certain sensitive young face. One day, when the first essay of the class was under discussion, she asked each new pupil to bring her some composition written during the year before, that she might judge the work and know precisely with what material she had to deal. Rebecca lingered after the others and approached the desk shyly. "I haven't any compositions here, Miss Maxwell, but I can find one when I go home on Friday. They are packed away in a box in the attic." "Carefully tied with pink and blue ribbons?" asked Miss Maxwell with a whimsical smile. "No," answered Rebecca, shaking her head decidedly. "I wanted to use ribbons, because all the other girls did, and they looked so pretty, but I used to tie my essays with twine strings on purpose, and the one on solitude I fastened with an old shoelacing just to show it what I thought of it." "Solitude!" laughed Miss Maxwell, raising her eyebrows. "Did you choose your own subject?" "No. Miss Dearborn thought we were not old enough to find good ones. That were some of the others: Fireside Reveries, Grant as a Soldier, Reflections on the Life of P.T. Barnum, Buried Cities. I can't remember any more now. They were all bad, and I can't bear to show them. I can write poetry easier and better, Miss Maxwell." "Poetry!" she exclaimed. "Did Miss Dearborn require you to do it?" "Oh no, I always did it even at the farm. Shall I bring all I have? It isn't much." Rebecca took the blank book in which she kept copies of her effusions and left it at Miss Maxwell's door, hoping that she might be asked in and thus obtain a private interview. But a servant answered her ring, and she could only walk away disappointed. A few days afterward she saw the black-covered book on Miss Maxwell's desk, and knew that the dreaded moment of criticism had come. So she was not surprised to be asked to remain after class. The room was quiet. The red leaves rustled in the breeze and flew in at the open window, bearing the first compliments of the season. Miss Maxwell came and sat by Rebecca's side on the bench. "Did you think these were good?" she asked, giving her the verses. "Not so very," confessed Rebecca. "But it's hard to tell all by yourself. The Perkinses and the Cobbs always said they were wonderful, but when Mrs. Cobb told me she thought they were better than Mr. Longfellow's, I was worried, because I knew that couldn't be true." This ingenious remark confirmed Miss Maxwell's opinion of Rebecca as a girl who could hear the truth and profit by it. "Well, my child," she said smilingly, "your friends were wrong, and you were right. Judged by the proper tests, they are pretty bad." "Then I must give up all hope of ever being a writer," sighed Rebecca, who was tasting the bitterness of hemlock, and wondering if she could keep the tears back until the interview was over. "Don't go so fast," interrupted Miss Maxwell. "Though they don't amount to anything as poetry, they show a good deal of promise in certain directions. You almost never made a mistake in rhyme or metre, and this shows you have a natural sense of what is right, a sense of form, poets would call it. When you grow older, have a little more experience, in fact, when you have something to say, I think you might write very good verses. Poetry needs knowledge and vision, experience and imagination, Rebecca. You have not the first three yet, but I rather think you have a touch of the last." "Must I never try any more poetry, not even to amuse myself?" "Certainly you may. It will only help you to write better prose. Now for the first composition. I am going to ask all new students to write a letter giving some description of the town and a hint of the school life." "Shall I have to be myself?" asked Rebecca. "What do you mean?" "A letter from Rebecca Randall to her sister Hannah at Sunnybrook Farm, or to her Aunt Jane at the brick house, Riverboro, is so dull and stupid, if it is a real letter. But if I could make believe I was a different girl altogether, and write to somebody who would be sure to understand everything I said, I could make it nicer." "Very well. I think that's a delightful plan," said Miss Maxwell. "And whom will you suppose yourself to be?" "I like heiresses very much," replied Rebecca contemplatively. "Of course I never saw one, but interesting things are always happening to heiresses, especially to the golden-haired kind. My heiress wouldn't be vain and haughty like the wicked sisters in Cinderella. She would be noble and generous. She would give up a grand school in Boston because she wanted to come here where her father lived, when he was a boy, long before he made his fortune. The father is dead now, and she has a guardian, the best and kindest man in the world. He is rather old, of course, and sometimes very quiet and grave, but sometimes, when he is happy, he is full of fun, and then Evelyn is not afraid of him. Yes, the girl shall be called Evelyn Abercrombie, and her guardian's name shall be Mr. Adam Ladd." "Do you know Mr. Ladd?" asked Miss Maxwell in surprise. "Yes, he's my very best friend," cried Rebecca delightedly. "Do you know him too?" "Oh yes, he's a trustee of these schools, you know, and often comes here. But if I let you suppose any more, you will tell me your whole letter, and then I shall lose a pleasant surprise." What Rebecca thought of Miss Maxwell we already know. How the teacher regarded the pupil may be gathered from the following letter, written 2 or 3 months later. Wareham, December 1st. My dear Father, as you well know, I have not always been an enthusiast on the subject of teaching. The task of cramming knowledge into these self-sufficient and efficient youngsters of both sexes discourages me at times. The more stupid they are, the less they are aware of it. If my department were geography or mathematics, I believe I should feel that I was accomplishing something, for in those branches application and industry work wonders. But in English literature and composition one yearns for brains, for appreciation, for imagination. Month after month I toil on, opening oyster after oyster, but seldom finding a pearl. Fancy my joy this term, when, without any violent efforts at shell splitting, I came upon a rare pearl, a black one, but of satin skin and beautiful lustre. Her name is Rebecca, and she looks not unlike Rebecca at the well, in our family Bible, her hair and eyes being so dark as to suggest a strain of Italian or Spanish blood. She is nobody in particular. Man has done nothing for her. She has no family to speak of, no money, no education worthy the name, has had no advantages of any sort. But Dame Nature flung herself into the breach and said, "This child I to myself will take. She shall be mine, and I will make a lady of my own." Blessed Wordsworth, how he makes us understand! And the pearl never heard of him until now. Think of reading Lucy to a class, and when you finish, seeing a 14-year-old pair of lips quivering with delight, and a pair of eyes brimming with comprehending tears. You poor darling, you too know the discouragement of sowing lovely seed in rocky earth, in sand, in water, and it almost seems sometimes in mud, knowing that if anything comes up at all, it will be some poor starveling plant. Fancy the joy of finding a real mind, of dropping seed in a soil so warm, so fertile, that one knows there are sure to be foliage, blossoms, and fruits all in good time. I wish I were not so impatient and so greedy of results. I am not fit to be a teacher. No one is who is so scornful of stupidity as I am. The Pearl writes quaint, countrified little verses, doggerel they are, but somehow or other she always contrives to put in one line, one thought, one image, that shows you she is, quite unconsciously, to herself, in possession of the secret. Good-bye. I'll bring Rebecca home with me some Friday, and let you and your mother see her for yourselves. Your affectionate daughter, Emily. End of chapter 21.